Okay, good morning councillors, good morning officer colleagues. Welcome to this first session of Economy and Development Select in 2019. Happy New Year to everyone. Hope you all had a good Christmas. Before we go into the agenda items, if we just go around and do a brief introduction for those watching at home. I'm Councillor Paul Pavier, I'm Chair of this committee.
Hazel Eilert, Scrutiny.
Nicola Perry, Democratic Services.
Mark Howcroft, Assistant Head of Finance.
Peter Davis, Chief Officer for Resources.
Francis Williams, Chief Officer, Enterprise.
Phil Murphy, Cabinet Member for Resources.
Robert Dwyer, Head of Business Transformation.
Armand Watts, Stillmore Councillor.
Fakins, Councillor for Monmouth.
Richard Worden, Dixon Rosebaston of Woolworth, Monmouth, and member of this committee.
Alan Davis, Vice Chair of the committee.
Councillor David Davey for Logs, St Kingsmouth Group. Sorry, just to be true again. St Kingsmouth Ward in Chepstow and a member of this committee.
And I'm Councillor Tony Easton, visiting the committee today, not a member.
Thank you everyone. Can I obviously welcome the Cabinet Member, Councillor Murphy. Very welcome this morning, and obviously Councillor Easton as well, Observer. Obviously very welcome to ask questions, Tony. If we go into the agenda items then, item number 1, apologies for absence. Do we have any apologies?
We just received apologies from Councillor Becker.
Okay, thank you very much. Agenda item 2 then, declarations of interest. Are there any declarations at this stage? No. If something does obviously occur to you as we go through the agenda items, if you just declare it, and we make sure we give you the pro forma to sign. Agenda item 3 then is the public open forum. I don't believe we've got anyone from the public to take up that opportunity this morning. So agenda item 4 then is the Capital Strategy Assessment 2018-19 and the draft capital budget proposals 1920 to 22-23. It's a pretty weighty document. I'm sure councillors have ploughed through that over this last week or so. I'm going to obviously hand over to officer colleagues. Peter, are you going to start, or Mark? Mark, I'm just going to give a brief overview and then we go into questions. Thank you.
Firstly, I'd just like to reiterate the correspondence I gave you yesterday around some of the appendices being jumbled up. So apologies if that's added to any confusion, but I hope in terms of giving you a verbal update today, I can basically take you through that report and get your feedback on it. So it's slightly different in terms of format than the usual report, largely as a consequence that the councils have a new responsibility on them from 1920 to actually provide a capital strategy. The idea behind a capital strategy is it looks to actually tie resources to a lot of our corporate documents where actually historically they've been separate. What we have to do for 2018-19 is actually evaluate our preparedness against that. So a lot of the early part of the document is reminding members around our administrative and procedural matters and whether they actually lend themselves to this new environment. What you will find is that whilst we've historically provided a capital MTFP on a 4-year basis, a capital strategy will commonly look over a 10-year basis, so there is a slight change of emphasis with that. But probably the most important point to highlight to you in that first section is that I have had a go at trying to rank the importance of particular projects, because members have still subscribed to the view that actually for anything new to appear in the capital programme, it either needs to pay for itself, i.e. be self-affording, or it replaces something because it's of a higher priority than something already in the capital programme. Probably the weakness with that view historically is that, well, in not ascribing any relative importance to some of these things, it's very difficult for members to make those sort of judgments. So in paragraph 4.2 11, I've actually looked to describe some of the common capital projects and what I consider to be the relative importance. That doesn't mean that that full council subsequently will agree to that, and you'll appreciate that actually it's full council that sets the capital programme, not necessarily cabinet. But it would be worthwhile getting some feedback from you this morning as to whether you feel that that priority setting is the right one or ought to be amended. The latter part of the report is the detail of next year's capital programme. It really starts in section 6 onwards. Effectively, the capital programme is prepared on the existing basis, i.e. nothing obviously new. It does, in recognising the capital strategy, volunteer a couple of changes to the capital programme going forward for next year, things like splitting the property maintenance fees from the works so that members can get a better appreciation of the on-costs of works and the direct costs of any capital works. It also recommends reinstating surveying budget, recognising the fact that actually in the priority listing I've put health and safety and regulatory requirements as the number one priority that we have to address. So actually having accurate and up-to-date information in an explicit fashion seems very sensible. Those projects are anticipated to be funded from capital receipts balances, and you'll see that capital receipts balances appears in a number of tables in the report in 411 and 610. At the end of this year, we anticipate that balances will be the order of £3 million, and by the end of next year, £8 million. I'm not necessarily proposing straight off that we spend that, because commonly there is a bit of a delay between the predicted time of getting these receipts and the actual reality. So I wouldn't wish to incur that risk. And also I recognise that members have got some capital aspirations yet that haven't yet been quantified, things like their future schools tranche B aspirations. So actually having some resources in the tank to facilitate some of those conversations would seem inherently sensible. At that point, I'm quite happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks very much for that. So we kick off the questions then, Councillor Davis.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Mark, in section 4.7, there's a statement there about, if I can just briefly read it. I highlighted all this and it all disappeared. I had the same problem as for that. So I spent 2 days reading it and I highlighted it, and then when I called it back, it all disappeared. So you'll have to bear with me a minute, I'm afraid.
It's start 4.7 is
4.7.
The wider regeneration.
The wider
of the county.
generation of the county relies on housing, highways, education, property investment. It is part funded. Now, everybody can read that for themselves. That's an important statement, I think. And then if we go on to 4.10, which is where I'm getting a little bit concerned, is we make reference to the formation of this housing company, which the council has already mandated that we move in that direction. But there's no provision within that system for developing that. As you can see, there's no capital funding for it. There is no money within the whole document allocated to that. Now, when you look at what the consultants that the council has employed have been telling us about the need for housing and to generate business, and when we look at the decision at Raglan in terms of being called in with the Welsh Government, and what implication that has for unallocated sites, then for the future of this county, I think, I would see that in terms of housing and attracting business as a priority for this council. And I'm not seeing it within this document at all. So perhaps Phil or somebody could tell me where we're going with that.
Could I come back first and just explain the context? Yeah, what I was trying to do in those paragraphs was just to describe some of the projects and priorities that I perceive that the council and members have. I realise the importance of affordable housing to you, and was describing that actually in the environment of actually outsourcing its housing revenue account, which would be its traditional interest in housing, that actually it would have to do it in a different fashion, and describing that actually if I look across other councils, commonly the way that they do that is through setting up housing companies. So I was looking at the administration involved in that in relation to how it applies to the need to set a capital strategy. What I'm not doing here is by the back door getting approval for such a thing to be set up. I fully expect that to be a detailed report that's actually sent to members for consideration.
If I can just say, Chair, that in relation to affordable housing is important, but the future of the county in general is also important, and the emphasis was that it's not, as much as we have thousands of people waiting, it's also about providing new housing to attract people in and new businesses into the county as well. So I appreciate that you were writing in a different context, but I'm going through the capital, and I've read all of these documents, and I'm not seeing much emphasis on it. And as far as the LDP is concerned, I think that's really, and the more I see about unallocated sites and things, the more I'm beginning to move in the direction of we really need to be looking at building a new town or something like that. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, we get the political
can I-
context now from the cabinet member.
Is this on? Because you can never tell with this one, because it doesn't light up. That bit does. Obviously, calling in sites like the Raglan is a worry. I was just discussing that with Ahmed earlier on. And of course, they've got 12 months to fiddle about with that, so we really don't know what the Welsh Government's view is on these unallocated sites. As regards the housing development company, there will be a report brought to council in April. At least that's the plan. There's a lot of research going on at the moment with regards to the setting up of a development company, not necessarily specifically a housing development company, although that was the direction that council agreed that we should go in. There's been some progress made by other authorities which we're thoroughly checking out prior to coming up with proposals ourselves. And of course, this is subject of a motion coming before council next week. But as I say, there is progress on it. There will be a report which clearly sets out what the proposals are, and we would hope that we can bring that forward in April.
Do you want to comment, Councillor Davies, before I bring in Councillor Watts on the same point?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not trying to make any political points here. I'm concerned about the future of this county. And I think we all recognise that, you know, there's a lot of work to be done, and we really need to start thinking outside of the traditional box in order to ensure that the people of Monmouthshire get what they deserve in terms of jobs, housing, and as far as this council is concerned, looking at these figures, these revenue figures, it's essential that we get more income into this council as well. Thank you.
Councillor Watson, on the same point.
Precisely my point. Is, I mean, it's an economic no-brainer going forward. I've got my mic on, I promise. Because as we were just talking about it, just to assure each other that obviously the more houses that you build in the south of the county, because property prices are inevitably going to be higher because they're in close proximity to Bristol, you're going to get more revenue out of it. And whilst I appreciate there are other issues relating to infrastructure that need to be ironed out, but I'm not convinced that this authority is woken up to the impact, the full impact it's having on rents, because it's a supply and demand market. And I'm not convinced that, in fact, that you're going to the right people trying to look for consultants when best practice is not very, so for example, with I think the exception of Bristol and Sheffield, I think, there isn't really any best practice in this field. I've tried, I'm going to be absolutely honest with you, tried to open up private channels where we could sit down as an authority and sit with Bristol City Council, and they're quite willing, even though they have a different political dimension than we do, to sit down with us and show us and explain to us where they went wrong in that process, where there were pitfalls in that process. And this is lagged on, Phil, for months now. So you have a willing cabinet member of a city authority that's already been through this, sat down with Wiltshire County Council, a Conservative council, giving them advice how to go forward, and nobody in the authority is doing anything about it. But at the same time, you know, you'll quite willingly sit down and spend lots of money with consultants. And I'm sorry if you think that's political, but that seems to be the case. Now, if I'm wrong, tell me. But, oh, okay.
If Councillor Murphy, then if you could give the political dynamic, and then perhaps perhaps some of the officers might look at the sort of procurement angle in terms of consultancy.
I know that Peter wants to come in. There will be a meeting with Bristol. There will also be a meeting with some Welsh authorities. They've been the Welsh one's been lined up. The Bristol one, I spoke to Deb Hill-Hells yesterday, funnily enough, about that, and I know she thoroughly intends to pursue that line. The reason for the delay, I have the mic on, Armand, if you don't mind. The reason for the delay is that our small team that works on that was heavily involved in the Castlegate development, and you can't split yourself in too many pieces. But I know Peter's itching to come in, so I'll stop at that.
Thanks, Councillor Murphy, and thanks, Armand, as well. I think the provocation was absolutely the right one. I think the issues are, and they are well understood. You know, I think we've had discussions previously, you know, and you know, I think the debate has opened itself out in the chamber. I think it was back in the summer. And I know a motion is being tabled by Labour leader, Councillor Petroni, at Council next week, where I guess some of the same messages will be fed back, you know, and a level of comfort as well, just in terms of progress that is actually in fact being made. I think I just want to pick up on Phil's last point, really, which is one around us, in a way, cutting our teeth in some fashion. We have strategic sites that we of our own that we are moving forward at the moment, and beyond Councillor Murphy referring to the Castlegate deal, which consumed and absorbed an awful lot of the team's time, a lot of legal input, etc., in getting that deal across the line. You know, we'll be discussing equally in the revenue budget proposals later on, and contained within those is a beyond the income and the further saving that we're looking to yield on the Castlegate site, further commercial incomes to the tune of £400,000. And clearly there is significant work needing to be done in order to assess deals, run due diligence, and actually bring those to the fore before we can actually run into financial close and start generating any return. So, you know, we're, as Phil alludes to, you know, we've got to balance our resource effectively. The reason I'm not overly concerned at the moment is that I don't think our critical path is in fact affected in terms of where we collectively are wanting to get to and where we are trying to get to. The Crick Road site is progressing. It's progressing well. You know, I've got good levels of comfort now around that accelerating its way through in 2019, and a couple of our other strategic sites are also well in train now in terms of outline planning and planning consent being achieved. And we are looking to look at alternative build methodologies where we can actually look to drop cost, you know, coming back to this point around looking to derive more affordable housing. And in and alongside that, and just to echo Phil's point, we are running these discussions at the moment. So I think, Armand, your point is well made in terms of Bristol. They are, I think, well placed within the UK in terms of you know what they've accelerated and advanced, and we can learn well from that. My point around the critical path is that if we set a housing company up right now at this point in time, I wouldn't have a pipeline to bring through it immediately. So what I'm trying to do at the minute is to balance our resource to make sure that we're getting the acquisitions through to obviously deal with our commercial strategy. Making sure that we are making suitable and adequate progress on our strategic sites, but making sure that we're doing all the groundwork behind the scenes to make sure that when we bring things in front of council in April, we are well placed to then move forward. As I say, if we had a housing company set up right here today, there would not be a pipeline to bring forward and through it. So all of that has got to be put in place in the background, such that when we bring such an entity and an arrangement in place, that we've got throughput. It's got to have throughput. in order to, this is all about impact and outcome, which I think is ultimately the issues that members are bringing forward.
If I may just come back on that point, I mean, that where it's, I understand what you're saying from a county perspective, from your perspective, but the economic, from the social perspective is, and you'd expect me to say this, representing a ward where 33% of the children live in my ward live in deprivation. Deprivation, this is the 21st century. And those children are susceptible to exposure, or I should say their families are susceptible to disproportionately high rental charges. And that's the reason why they're living in deprivation. And so you'd expect me to say, you need to get busy with it. I asked you about this, and I've had private conversations with you. I've been open and transparent about it. I've tried to set this up, and it just feels to me that you're dragging your heels. I understand what you're saying, but we need to get busy with it. Bristol started somewhere at some point, and they might have not had the pull through, or whatever the phrase you use, but they started somewhere. You need to get on top of this. And you're not going to get any resistance, that's the thing, politically. Everybody's saying exactly the same thing. We're all singing from the same hymn sheet. We know it's got to happen. So just get on with it.
I know members will certainly have an opportunity next week during the motion to bring up, various elements of concern. But I do, I take your point. I empathise with your point. Councillor David, are you coming back on housing? Yeah. Okay.
Just briefly, I think that we've got to add a sense of realism to this. It's about what our vision is for the future, really. And there are no easy answers to that. And I'm agreeing with what Peter's saying. Forming a housing company today isn't going to resolve the problems. It's going to take time. And there are a number of other issues there because I've been reading the LDP, and we're very short of sites in general, from what I've seen, whether it's for business or for housing. So there are implications there, and all of that is going to take time. I just need to be reassured that, in view of what's happened at Raglan, that perhaps our strategy needs to change somewhat. And forming a company with housing and development is a good idea, I think. It's going to take time, but as long as I think I can see that we're traveling. I have my own ideas, obviously, but I'm not in a position to put those into practice. But I would like to see us really concentrating on developing the business and the whole model about where this county is going to go, and getting a consensus on it. Thank you, Chair.
If I could just add something to that, Chair. Yep. The purpose of making it more of a development company than a housing company is that a housing company could potentially fall foul of the terms of the housing stock transfer, when we transferred all our housing stock over to Monmouthshire Housing, and that there are complications there. So, just to hopefully wrap up on this particular point, it isn't that nothing's been happening. There's been quite a lot happening, and it's been accelerating through this process since the team was freed up from Castlegate.
Thank you, Councillor Murphy. And I'm sure, in terms of Councillor Davis's ideas, we've got a number of workshops coming up, not just in the coming weeks, but probably across this year and into next on the LDP. Senior officers and cabinet members will be involved, and I'm sure they'd be very, very interested to listen to your ideas, Councillor Davis, as well as others. Councillor Roden, are you on housing, or are you moving on to a different point? That's fine if you are.
Something totally separate,
okay.
if I may.
Okay.
You mentioned, Mark, table 411, the ranking table. I just had one little comment on that, and it says, why is attracting third-party or private match funding a lower priority than perhaps it should be? Because in section 415 it says that we will be looking to do more of this. So just a small question, that one. And secondly, possibly more important, I noticed that the investment committee are raising £50 million over a period of time, potentially, for commercial investment. Would this actually increase the risk profile of the council when viewed from bodies that are lending us money? Would it affect our interest rates over time? Because we're moving from a staid, potentially viewed organisation to something more dynamic and potentially more risky. Thank you.
If I take the points in order, I can see how I could easily move that attracting significant third-party and private match funding further up the schedule. I can see that actually in looking at it, I was looking within the organisation first and then outside the organisation afterwards. So that's why I put things like health and safety, regulatory, needing to set a balanced budget and satisfy the corporate plan aspects as I have. But I think that attracting match funding could equally be regarded as having a similar priority as creating sustainable income streams. So I'll have a look at that before it goes to full council in February, if that's okay. In terms of the commercial investment side of it, Treasury advisors would always advocate there is a speculative nature to any investment. There is no cast iron certainty, and that's one of the challenges that local authority has in the stewardship of public funds, that actually sit for look at the commercial investments, central government look at those, and I think it will only take one authority that actually gets in a situation where it incurs a large loss on it, where actually everyone looks around and says, well, we could have done this differently. We are going into this process in a very prudent fashion, so the number of investment opportunities presented to the investment committee, well, they're finite in nature anyway, but in meeting the requirements to satisfy a rate of return that warrant them getting to the investment committee, those are in the minority. No, it won't affect the council's future financial standing and ability to borrow, because unlike businesses, we have access to something called the Public Works Loan Board, and that actually provides funding across the public sector, largely at quite preferential rates to that received by the market.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Rowe, you happy with that? Yep. Questions? Councillor Feakins?
And not to rehash the housing issue, but just to touch on it very quickly, the only way we are going to solve the housing issue in this county is by being honest with all our residents and saying that we need to build 3,000 houses just to pick up the backlog of housing that we need. That's not going to happen because, as Pete said, we haven't got any housing plots to buy. There aren't any available. And the LDP isn't allowing us that flexibility as we are at the moment to bring that forward. So there's some real key issues there which we can bring up in other meetings, but the honesty approach needs to be that we need to tell all the residents of Monmouthshire that we need to build a lot more houses and quickly within the next LDP if we want to resolve the housing crisis that we've got before us, because that's going to get year on year worse and worse. So just to touch on that point, but just bringing it back to the report before us at the moment, just looking at some of the capital assets that we own. Obviously, not to declare, I don't think I need to declare an interest at the moment, but I'm a trustee on Mon Life. But just to bring up some of those points that opportunity could bring before us. Mon Life is potentially going to be a tenant in some of those assets that we own. And obviously, the stronger a tenant we have, the better covenant that produces, and therefore the better value we end up having in that capital asset. Which, in 5 years' time, if you've got a very strong tenant paying a good rental income or looking after the maintenance and looking after the repairs, that in itself could alleviate some of the sort of near-term issues regarding maintenance and also regarding the liability, the ongoing liability of that asset from year 5 onwards, possibly. But I think that they should have. I know we haven't got to that position yet. I think we should have maybe included a little bit of that in here, only to say that this is a possibility that would relieve some of the pressures on us having to maintain those assets, depending on how that's structured. More importantly, if we are focused on creating a vehicle through Mon Life, which is going to be strong and capable of taking some of those pressures off from us, then that in itself could give us a better reasoning to really underpin and really support that potential ADM model, that ADM.
Yeah, I appreciate a lot of those points. I mean, the report at the moment tries to be honest to where we are in our decision making. Hence, it mentions development companies. Hence, it mentions Mon Life. I think you're absolutely right. But I also think there's a bit of water to flow under the bridge before I can fully understand what those business models might be. There are still choices to be made about whether we provide a concessionary rent level to Mon Life, because at one level we want it to go forward from the start in the best opportunity to succeed. As another, you could offer it full repairing rents and do exactly as you say in terms of actually get a third party to manage our buildings for us. I think that will all be captured in the management agreement that is still an evolving piece of work. What I would say in a conciliatory fashion in raising some of these issues around Mon Life, around development company, this report has done exactly what I intended it to do and get members thinking about the future capital strategy and what's important to them.
Thank you. Cheers, Mark. And that's well understood. And I think that the reason for my bringing that forward was probably to get some focus about some of those key issues, because there's a real opportunity there for us as an authority to create some more meat onto the bone, which isn't potentially there at the moment by us doing it in-house. So that was the reason. But thank you.
Are there other questions? Nothing more? There was, I know there was some discussion in the pre-meeting about risk, and certainly about risk. Did you want to come in, Councillor Watts?
Yeah. So I guess what I'm concerned about is when we enter into contracts with developers. So, for example, I would be looking at, the recent publicity surrounding the asbestos at Caldecott School. So, what I'm concerned about is the level of expertise within the authority and hiring in the level of expertise to protect ourselves about potential risk. So, for example, in Thornwall School, when that was built, as you know, Phil, I played close scrutiny to the development of that. I used to go to monthly meetings. And there's a little computer program that analyzes risk, that shows you, there's a little graph that goes up, and it shows you, kind of indicates, financial risk through inflationary costs, about delays in supplies, and, if they come across asbestos. And Thornwall School was a school that had asbestos. But it just seems to me that it's not just about the 21st century school, it's about then having the level of expertise, but also then when we go into contract, alleviating ourselves from some of the responsibility. So, for example, when we went into developing or redoing up the old Y Bridge, I can remember that was a contract that we went into, and we had a little bit of money from Forrester Dean. The developers were jointly responsible, or should I say the developers, but the contractors were jointly responsible for a delay in that, and there were penalties built into those contracts. I don't understand why the onus seems to be always on the public purse, that if things go wrong, if there's a delay, or if a known unknown, as Matt put it earlier, which I thought was a good phrase, is presented to us, that it's always us, as in the public purse, that takes the hit. Why can't it be the developers? Because then it's more of an equal and understanding and a better business relationship. And it builds up trust in the long term with, if we're going to use those people again. Caldecott School is when I looked at I was talking earlier to the officer, we had he intimated a 1% contingency built into that development, where most public, when we're investing in public buildings or any kind of development, we're looking at, you can go online, the standard practice is 5 to 10%. So I'm concerned about the level of risk and our understanding about, further developments about mitigating understanding that risk and offsetting that risk, Phil. Can you give me some answer over to how you think we can go forward with this?
Well, when you come to asbestos in particular, the main problem with the period in which a lot of those buildings were put up is that there was a lot of hidden asbestos, and it isn't particularly under the floor. It's been discovered recently, and it was certainly that was the case at Caldecott, and I happen to know that it was a massive problem at Oakdale when Oakdale was taken down. Not that that's in this authority, but my son was the engineer who was taking Oakdale School down, and he was the one who found it. So I know quite a bit about where all of these problems are arising. And I do have concerns about about what we're going to find at Monmouth, although the lessons from Caldecott and other schools around have been taken on board by the engineers who are assessing the degree of asbestos removal. And it's not just asbestos, I'm just using that as an example. Now, the pricing is set based on the reports of information available at that particular time. So if you do find something that wasn't known about during the period, then the contractor hasn't quoted for it, and as a result of that, you do get these additional charges. Quite how you get round a massive contingency with these constraints that are put on budgets these days, I don't know. It's all very well saying it in theory. In practice, it doesn't quite work out that way. But there's an awful lot of effort goes in to trying to mitigate that at the commissioning stage to cut down any problems that come out later on.
Do you want to come back on that? Yeah.
About is that we have limited access to, certainly from the private sector as well. The private sector are pretty hot on this. They're sitting down and everybody's trying to, I guess, alleviate as much risk they possibly can when entering into a contract. And what I worry about is that the state of play, the industry that we're into, I mean, they're very canny. That's how they make their millions effectively. Have we got the access to the right level of expertise through quantity surveyors when we go in and negotiate a contract? Are we exposing ourselves to a fully eyes wide open, albeit that it's, as Matt said earlier, known unknowns, Phil?
We do have our own team, particularly again using asbestos. We have a member of the team who's particularly well qualified from that point of view. And yes, all I can say is our property services team put an awful lot of effort into trying to make sure they get this right. Pete, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think there's only a couple of brief points, really, and to cover off a point that Armin made earlier on in his input that I don't think has been properly covered off. So, I just echo the point there, Phil. I mean, I think I don't particularly have too many concerns in terms of what we both have in-house and actually what we actually contract in by way of support. There are, as Phil said, there's lessons to be learned, not just on the asbestos, but I think we're all familiar with decisions that had to be taken back into council, escalating cost envelope around 21st century schools. And, there are clearly lessons to be learned around that. For those who keep abreast of the the committee cycles and papers going through Cabinet yesterday, there was a report that went through with regards to additional investment going into the legal department. One of the key facets within that investment is actually to strengthen our capabilities around, commercial contract lawyers. And that is necessary. We've been bringing that in from outside previously, but we need to build that capability from within equally, and that needs to work very closely then with our property services department to make sure that when we're working through that negotiation period, and you're absolutely right that some of these things are actually ironed out. We don't expose ourselves unduly to circumstances that might arise subsequent. Whether that's during the build-out phase or beyond. We've got to make sure that we're well placed in having that expertise as much in-house as available to us.
If I may, can I help in trying to solve this solution or present a solution, solve this problem, I should say, in as much as wouldn't it be easier to approach other local authorities who are under, going through the 21st century school projects and pool our resources, our legal resources? Because to get, we are a small authority, we only pay so much, and I'm not dissing, the level of expertise. I think that the level of expertise that we've got is actually very good, and it's quite dynamic, and it keeps abreast of the change. But we do, law is a very complicated thing, and contract law is a very specific thing. Rather than going hiring out, very, very expensive city lawyers to negotiate contracts that we can't simply continue to afford? Wouldn't it be better just to pool our resources with other local authorities?
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that point. I mean, I think the reflection, and it's the one that Matt Phillips, our head of legal, made back into Cabinet yesterday. I mean, I think a point around collaboration and as to what extent that would play out, I think that is something not for now. It is to be considered once Matt has stabilised and consolidated what is needed within the legal department. Some of that is making sure that we've got adequate provision for things around children's services, and obviously all the legal work that plays out through there. Some of it, and please recognise, just in terms of on the sort of commercial front, you know, we are a front runner within Wales. So if you expect to go into other authorities' legal departments and be able to, you know, lift out high value, high order commercial contract lawyers, you're not going to find that. So you know, it's a capability that we need to build from within, and if we get into a position of suitable strength, then we obviously look at the collaboration model. I'm going to be careful in terms of my use of words, but I don't think, and I'm offering sort of some personal viewpoint on this, I don't think that actually engaging with some of our neighbouring authorities at this point in time is the right thing to do. That might actually slow us in terms of the progress that we wish to make, in terms of strengthening our capabilities in the first run, because they themselves have their own issues with their own legal departments. I think, you know, you've got to take these steps in the right way. There's got to be a sequence and order to it, and I think Matt described that very well in Cabinet yesterday in terms of making sure that we shore up our own capabilities first before actually taking on board and working with other authorities, because those other authorities are actually, in fact, on the flip side, wanting to work with us because they themselves have their own issues with their own legal departments. So be careful what you wish for if you want to lean into collaboration with other authorities who maybe don't have the strength and capability that you yourselves have.
And if I could just add to that, Chair, there have been attempts made, and I made this point in Cabinet yesterday, there have been attempts made regionally over the last 10 years, I think. Yeah, probably. To have a sort of combined legal team that would have the funding necessary to get the top people and actually have them working. There was absolutely no appetite amongst the other authorities for that. So Peter is absolutely right. You know, if we're going to get this expertise, we need to build it ourselves.
Can I bring in Mark before I bring in Councillor Fegans?
Yeah, I appreciate I don't always have a balanced view about some of these things. Seldom do I get invited to projects that work particularly well. It's more things where there are overspends or where there are problems to fix where I'm involved. So my perspective isn't a balanced one. There are lots of things that work well in this council. A lot of the questions that you ask are questions I ask myself every time we get into a significant capital works. So having, say, 1% contingencies, is that reasonable? Well, the reality is that I could put a 5 or a 10% contingency against that figure, but it only means that members are getting less of their aspirations filled. So there is always a balancing act to... Well, I think you have to appreciate that, Councillor. I mean, what we try to do is we try to get as much cost certainty as possible and run the project to that. It doesn't always work with the likes of asbestos, because the asbestos surveys that are undertaken are very much sampled asbestos and actually wouldn't necessarily reflect the amount in the ground. The responsibility and who's liable for it. I mean, yes, there is a risk and reward around these contracts, and we could push the risk out to the developer, but the developer is quite mercenary in these regards. If he has more risk, he expects more profit, and generally the costs of the project go up. So we try to take an even-handed approach with some of these framework contracts in terms of actually sharing the risk of these things. But ultimately, where we find a degree of asbestos that we weren't anticipating at a school site, the responsibility to remove it and deal with it appropriately will always rest with the council rather than the developer, because it is us that still want to use that site.
I'll bring you in a minute. No, I'll bring you in a minute because Councillor Fegans, I think, wants to add to this. So I'm going to bring in Councillor Fegans.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Armin. Mark, you've hit the nail on the head, and that's what I wanted to bring it, or just to say that this isn't around the contracts. This isn't around our capability of the contracts. That's a misnomer in this argument, I'm afraid. The nub of the issue is to do with risk around asbestos and the known unknowns. And if we were to try, and who accepts that risk going into a contract, if we take that risk on our shoulders and we find asbestos, we pay for the recovery, we pay for the cleanup of that asbestos on a pound per pound basis. If we transfer that risk out to the third party, that third party has got to pay for that asbestos, but he's also taken on the risk. So he's going to charge us £1.60 for that £1 risk. He has to, because that's the only way that he can work his model. So the cheapest way that we can go forward with that is to do exactly what we are doing at the moment. Admittedly, we could increase the contingency on asbestos now that we know that it's in these school buildings on the next project to 3%, for argument's sake. And if there's a benefit out of that, then we keep that benefit. That's a known unknown. But I think principally asking the legal team to transfer the risk onto a contingent party is foolhardy, because we'll end up paying a lot more for that in the long term than by accepting the risk ourselves, as we do as a landowner. If you've got asbestos on your land, you as the landowner are legally responsible for that asbestos. If we're paying for that pound for pound to have it cleaned up, as long as we're aware of that going into a contract, then I think the model we've got before us at the moment is still the best model.
Chair, if I can.
Bring you in briefly, Councillor
very,
Davis.
Very briefly. It's just that, so I do apologise that we've kind of bogged down specifically with them, asbestos. And it could be very, very, I'm not an expert on, I'm just saying it is from a wider perspective. Because when we look at the project, we look at the 21st Century Schools project, we went £11 million overspent on that project in 8 months. 8 months. That's certainly beyond any imagination or any kind of thought. I might have thought that we could have exposed ourselves to that level of overspend. So I guess the point I'm trying to say is that we, and you use the word mercenary, we have to be mercenary. We have to be mercenary on behalf of the public purse.
Did you want to come back, Councillor Murphy? And then I will bring in Councillor Davis.
The £11 million was not just an overspend. It wasn't actually an overspend at all. It was recognition of additional cost pressures within the construction industry. It was inflation on materials. It was changes of design. It was the moving of the swimming pool. It was all sorts of stuff. So, you know, just to say we overspent, we didn't overspend. We knew it before we even started.
Okay.
Oh, and I should add, and we built within budget.
Okay, Councillor Davis.
I don't want to talk about asbestos because I've got something else to say, but I will make a comment because I've worked on several multi-million-pound projects, and I've never worked on one yet where something hasn't come that you weren't expecting to come. And in terms of asbestos, it was widely used many years ago throughout all industry. And we within the steel industry have also been caught out with asbestos because we just didn't know it was there. And, you know, trying to put the cost of that on the contractor, it really, you know, it just doesn't make sense at all, to be honest. So that's as far as asbestos is concerned. But what I wanted to change the subject completely, because I'm not an expert on public finances, but I am looking at the level of reserves that we have. And in my humble opinion, should I be concerned about it? Because I am a little bit concerned that we are running very close to the wind in terms of our reserve strategy. And if one of these curveballs, which always, I've never worked on anything yet, where there hasn't been all of a sudden a curveball that comes from nowhere and hits you in the back of the head. And are we overly exposed in terms of our reserve strategy? That's my question. I don't know whether this is the right place to ask it because I've lost my highlights, but there we are.
Mark, do you want to answer that? Yeah.
I think it's equally as valid here as in the revenue consideration, but obviously the capital projects have a larger significance and therefore a more potential risk. You may remember that our financial planning assumption is that we hold a council fund balance, which is made up of the general county balance plus schools, of the order of £7 million. That's still currently within the window that members have set themselves in terms of financial planning assumptions. They said that they would be happy setting a budget where that figure was within 4 to 6% of net expenditure. And whilst it's still lower end of that, as you would expect in the climate that we're facing in terms of funding, it's still above the 4%. So from that perspective, yes, you should always have regard for it. I wouldn't wish to avoid that, but actually it's still it's still an affordable prospect. A lot of the emphasis when we report about reserves is around earmarked reserves, and actually you could get away with not having any earmarked reserves, because earmarked reserves are for a particular purpose. If you don't have a particular purpose for them and a need to create them, you don't need to hold them. Where I raise some concerns is that historically and traditionally it's sensible to have reserves that involve re-engineering of services, etc., especially in the present climate. And some of those around the redundancy reserve, the IT reserve, the investor save reserve are not going to provide us with the capacity and headroom that actually we can look to use those to pump prime any changes, which introduces a further risk that actually you need to derive savings from your change in practice to afford what you're trying to do.
Councillor Roden.
Thank you, Chair. Are there any external factors that are pressing on us at the moment that we should be taking into consideration? And do we have plans if the financial situation changes rapidly and radically to move to? Thank you.
Well, there are two obvious externalities in terms of the volume of contractors that we have to undertake any tender work, and what we're finding is that that's an increasingly small pool. You'll appreciate that some of the big historic public sector providers are experiencing problems in the press or have actually gone through. So when you get a smaller pool of contractors, you'll always have the potential for pushing up costs, which is obviously one risk to consider. The other one is around the interest rates and the affordability of our projects. Our capital projects are afforded by a degree of support from Welsh Government, capital receipts funding, but in the main, a degree of unsupported borrowing. Unsupported borrowing being borrowing that we can afford to pay back. At the moment, borrowing levels, interest levels are at a historic low point. It's a good time to borrow money, and the repayments are quite cheap. Probably no conversation about finance is complete without a mention of Brexit, so I'll mention it quickly and move on. The uncertainty around the markets regarding Brexit and not being able to know what will happen come April time could introduce a volatility to those markets. We're already anticipating that probably we're at the bottom of the curve in terms of interest rates and they're likely to rise. What we are doing in terms of our treasury action at the moment is actually just checking that we have a balanced portfolio in relation to spreading our risks in relation to interest rate volatility and having the right mix of fixed versus variable rate debt, short versus longer term debt. And actually we go to audit committee half yearly to actually explain where we sit in relation to a treasury strategy. So at the moment, I'm quite comfortable with the position. But I think if I could accurately predict the consequences of Brexit, I probably wouldn't be working for Monmouthshire County Council. I'd be working for the government. So it is a risk, but hopefully you can see some of the mitigating actions that we're taking to actually avoid putting all our eggs in one basket or actually being prohibitively affected by some of those volatilities.
Thanks. It's good to hear you've got a balanced portfolio, so you can spread the risk. Thanks.
Councillor Watts, you want to come back in on that?
It's just about specifically over the balanced portfolio. And so, for example, I know before your time, but we all read about it, Phil will know about it, when we got caught out with Ice Banky. Do you remember that many years ago? Have we got any gems, any little nuggets tucked away that you're looking at some of those investments? And I don't expect you to say, I think it's this company or I think it's that investment trust or whatever, for obvious reasons that you think, you know, with Brexit, the level of risk is compared to the other investments, because it's about is riskier than others. And say, for example, we did crash out of Europe, and in the possibility that it might be a run on the pound, which we've seen historically before when we've hit economic crisis, what impact would a run on the pound have on our investment?
Clearly, there's two aspects to treasury management. There's the borrowing and the investment aspect. Recent regulation, it's MiFID II, and I always forget the acronym. It's something the management of funds in. That's it. That means that actually we use the market less for investments than we perhaps would do historically, because the effect of that legislation means that any institutionalised investors, of which the public sector would be regarded as part, their resources, if trapped in a bank that goes through, are used in terms of the funding of that rescue package, rather than the government stepping in. So one of the consequences of that is that we generally invest short term, so that we're not exposing ourselves to any long-term debt that we can't get back. And we're also actually increasing our ranking in terms of actually looking at people's rating or standard before we actually place any money with them. Increasingly, we'll also use the Public Works Loan Board to invest in, or invest in other local authorities. So it is meaning that we're actually changing some of our traditional instruments and the way that we do invest, and it is increasingly harder to find appropriate places to invest. But actually we're in a net borrowing situation, not an investment situation. We're only investing our cash flow balances. And actually one of the ways that this works quite efficiently is that we look to utilise our balances to avoid borrowing rather than chasing higher investment returns.
I'm slightly taking some solace in the fact that Phil's looking slightly unclear about what the answer means, as well as I am, which is reassuring. So I mean this in a good spirit. To answer the question, and if there was again, simply put, what would happen? Just explain it to me again in layman terms. If there was a run on the pound, what would that mean for us?
Well, it wouldn't have any effect on our investments because we're not investing in the money markets. We're
Any other questions? No. I've probably got it's probably directed to Councillor Murphy in terms of our focus as an authority. We're in the middle of a consultation on our budget proposals for 1920. There's probably some public concern with, potential significant increase in council tax, in terms of where we were looking last year. We're potentially looking at closer to 6%. There's going to be members of the public, I think, are going to be saying, why don't the authority, are they being too commercially minded now, given the level of assets on their books, given the terms of maintenance that needs to be undertaken by some of those assets? Why is the council focusing on purchasing additional assets like Castlegate? Are they over levering themselves? Shouldn't they be focusing on delivering public services and delivering public services well? What would be that? What would be your message to the public who are watching today?
Quite straightforward, Chair. In the absence of funding coming in from Welsh Government, we either have to get it from council tax or increasing charges, or go out and get it from somewhere else. The commercial developments that we are engaging in are ones that give us substantial returns, and we're using those substantial returns to support frontline services. If we don't do that, you lose your frontline services.
And given the, because there is quite a substantial cost in terms of maintenance of some of our assets that we already have, should we be focusing on bringing those back up to spec? Should we be, I know the importance of the cabinet of put on Castlegate and potential revenue there, potentially, excuse me, bringing staff members back from Innovation House back here. And obviously that's a cost in terms of spending here and bringing the estate up to spec. But obviously there's an potential opportunity there in terms of renting out that property. But again, are we going away far too much away from what public organisations, but public local authorities should be there for in delivering public services, and we'd be in too, again, we'd be in too commercial. Do you think?
Well, again, Chair, I think I could possibly put it in a slightly different way. Public authorities that aren't adapting to the current circumstances are dying. We don't intend to die. We intend to move forward, and we will, if necessary, point the way to other authorities as to how they should be going. If we don't do these things, and everybody else around us is realising this, even those who are substantially better funded than us, are finding that they're having to do it as well. If we don't do these things, we will, as I said just now, we will end up having to curtail services, well, more than curtail them, services that are valued by the public will disappear. So we have to adapt. And this notion of what a local authority should be has to go, because local authorities can't be like that anymore.
Bringing Councillor Feakins, then Councillor Watts.
Thank you, Phil. Is it fair to say then, Phil, that we're in the process of changing some of those assets? Historically, we've always owned quite a big portfolio of farms and farmland, which hasn't generated a very good return, and we're changing that capital over into other assets, which are providing a much better return.
We are, yes. I mean, an awful lot of the things like county farms where they do come up for sale, and it's only those that are non-core. Core, for those watching, would be developable. Non-core is where tenancies quite often tenants will ask if they can purchase their farm. We don't have any known development potential for that farm, so under those circumstances we'll set it off. Those receipts are ring-fenced at the moment for 21st century schools, albeit that we did alter our procedures recently to allow us to make better use of interest rates within the process of dealing with receipts. But where possible, we will get rid of an asset, particularly where we don't need it. The Chair just mentioned Innovation House. Innovation House, we will be, over the next 12 months, moving everybody out of that. We already have a tenant in it. It's looking to be a very valuable asset. And again, we'll be adding to that revenue stream that is enabling us to support frontline services. So if we can get rid of something to reduce the cost of maintenance, and simply because we have got no further sensible use for it, well, then that's exactly what we'll do.
Okay. Councillor Watts.
I just wanted to, I understand what Paul's saying, really, and I really get the spirit of what he's saying, and it's about a balance, and I think there's a consensus for, it's not political, but it's whether or not we are a public service provider, and where do we go then as far as being entrepreneurial and, you know, showing some kind of innovation into the commercial market. But are we going to stop, Phil, where with a level of risk and exposure, where we've gone into things, and this goes back to my previous point, where we haven't got a level of expertise, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of goodwill, but we're asking people to do things that possibly are beyond their own capability. And I don't mean that in a bad way, because I know that there genuinely is a lot of goodwill and, you know, in society. And I'm sorry to say this, but, you know, for example, Caldecott Castle and the fiasco that played out there, really, with the Little Mix gig and the other ones where we lost up to, I think it was kind of close to £1 million in the end. Are we gonna? Well,
I don't think it was. It was nowhere near as much as that.
All right, okay. If it's less than
you
that,
should know.
Yeah.
You should know, Councillor, what the figures are.
Well,
it was around 150.
well, are we okay? If it's less than that, we can have a debate about that. But are we? That was just an example. Are we going to stop doing stuff like this, where we simply don't know what we're doing? Are we going to stick to the stuff that we're good at, or are we, to what degree are we going to continue to take this kind of risk where when we can least afford it.
Coming back to the point that Peter Davis made earlier on when he was talking about the building of the legal team, we're building that expertise around us.
It probably comes back to, and it just reminded me of something that I wanted to raise as well, and this probably is to Mark, and it probably goes on from what Councillor Watts has said and what we talked about earlier on about risk and capacity and expertise. 4.21 to 4.24, there's a discussion there around asset management group and the facilities management group and how they view outlook and potentially how that needs to change. Can you possibly unpack a little bit of that, Mark, please?
Yeah, I think whilst I wouldn't use the same language as perhaps Councillor Watts, I do appreciate his comments and actually acknowledge the fact that there is a challenge that actually traditional local authority services and expertise and skills, some of the new ways of working will involve people developing new abilities and needing new insights and experience. And that's not always easy for the local authority to do. I mean, we often pride ourselves that, well, you know, it's mentioned that we ought to be more private sector orientated. We ought to act more like the private sector. That's all very well, and what that probably means is, well, we ought to be more commercial. But actually, we're also, in terms of a local authority, a provider of services, irrespective of the commerciality of it, to very vulnerable groups in the council. And I think members do quite a good job historically about chunking up a declining budget in terms of satisfying responsibilities to the electorate. On average, and it's probably a good preamble to the revenue report, we have to take about £6 million out of the budget annually to get a balanced budget. Now, simplistically, there are only three ways of doing that. You either reduce your expenditure, and we try to do that where possible without withdrawing services by being more innovative about the way that we do things. You increase discretionary income. You charge for services that you provide directly that the electorate will be prepared to pay for, or you raise it collectively through council tax with all the protections around affordability that mechanism provides. But actually, the biggest single cost for a local authority is staff and time. Every year, there are generally less and less of us, and every year we're having to be more innovative and more insightful and develop new practices. That's the challenge and conundrum for this council over the next 4 years, is how it can actually do some of these things while still maintaining the traditional services that it has always supplied. I think that actually if the council didn't actively look at some of these proposals of doing things differently and better, we'd be more in the environment of actually having members to consider which services it didn't want to supply to the electorate. And that's a very different council than the one that I've joined. In terms of farm receipts, whilst we do look to rationalise them, and there is a distinction now between those which are strategic and not, our ability to influence large receipts in a quick fashion is probably quite limited, because what we're looking at is people's businesses and people's homes, and actually we have to take those opportunities when they present themselves in being... So there are a number of competing challenges for members in managing this budget, and it ultimately comes down to a fact of actually rationalising competing resources for different services. Hence why I think your budget deliberations on both revenue and capital will actually need to have regard increasingly for not whether you like individual proposals, but whether the consequence of that individual proposal allows you to carry on doing something that you do regard important. Officers have got to develop a more sophisticated conversation with members rather than a linear one in terms of whether you like proposals or otherwise. Would be my perspective on that.
Okay, conscious of time, and we've got the revenue paper to undertake next. Are there any further questions? Can I look to summarise now? Okay, so we looked at, I think we've exhausted a number of areas there, particularly around asbestos. housing and the importance of housing for the authority moving forward, not just as an economic driver, but obviously ensuring there's an affordability for our residents, and obviously attracting those people in is really important. We touched on the potential impact of Raglan and what that's going to mean to unallocated sites. Obviously, a reminder, next week we've got the first, no, not next week, week after, 22nd, we've got the first of our LDP workshops, and we'll be starting to explore this in some detail. But I think councillors have pushed the point that we need to be looking at exemplar councils and take in advice if it's there, if it's free. We need to be taking that. But obviously, we understand, the councils need to balance in resource, and with commercial acquisitions that have been happening. Some of these things get pushed back, but there is an important issue there to take forward. We looked at risk, obviously in relation to capital investment, and we looked at, I think Councillor Feekins then touched about, in terms of Monlife and assets there. We've spoken about risk and level of expertise, and trying to understand the balance between the public sector and the commercial contractor. Obviously, in relation to asbestos was a big one, but we did widen that up. Reserve strategy, we touched on some of the concerns there about the risk in terms of being inflexible and having the inflexibility to change models, particularly around investor save. Without that cushion, it becomes increasingly difficult. We looked at external risk in terms of obviously Brexit, the vulnerability of some of our major contractors that we work with, obviously not just here in Monmouthshire, but big UK contractors, and in terms of the investment rates and affordability of projects, and we touched on unsupported borrowing there, etc. And looked at portfolio and balanced portfolios, and I think Mark gave us some assurance there that the way we're moving ahead with our portfolios is in a balanced way. There is likely to be some volatility more than some volatility if we have a disorderly Brexit. So I think it's going to be watch this space. But again, we've got a Brexit workshop next Tuesday, for members, and some of those issues will be discussed there as well. So in terms of recommendations then, to consider and provide feedback upon the budget assumptions, pressures and saving pro formas affecting this select portfolio area. I think we've given feedback. Are there any specific recommendations that the committee would like to put forward, Councillor Watts?
I was going to say, just cheekily, I'll invite the Tory cabinet to the Brexit workshop. Maybe we can make some progress on it there. Thank you.
Yeah, if we're all still talking to one another after the vote next week, yeah, maybe, yeah. Are there any specific recommendations, or are we happy with the feedback given? Yeah. Yeah, fine. Okay, thanks, Mark, for highlighting that again. Okay, are we happy with everything else then? Yeah, we can move on. Okay. So the next agenda item, item 5, is the revenue budget proposals 2019-20, which are open for consultation. I hope we all haven't exhausted our questioning on the capital side of things. Are you going to kick off, Councillor Murphy? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And we did stray quite considerably into this report, I think, during the last one, and all very constructively, so thank you for that. As Mark said, we start every year by having to take about £5 or £6 million pounds out of the budget. It doesn't matter what the medium-term financial planning indicates, even if it indicates a balanced situation for the following year. It's always 5 million or so before we have to make some progress, and that's all due to unavoidable pressures coming through into the system. And it's not just pressures that are created within this council. I mean, people will be aware that the capital threshold for people being able to hang on to their savings before care homes take them all away is increasing. That's wonderful for the individuals. It's put over £500,000 worth of additional pressure on us because that money's got to be made up, and it's the local authorities that make it up. So I just use that as one example of how we always get these additional pressures every year. And if you look at 3.3, in there's a table that sets out the gross expenditure and the pressures. And it also indicates a reduction in funding from Welsh Government of 1%. I'll come back onto that in a minute. The table, and it's on page 2 of the report there, shows that we're going out to consultation on a gap of 594,000 as it currently stands. And it is true to say that we've had a better settlement of that than that in the final settlement that came through on the 18th of December, I think it was. And our cut is now 0.3%, not 1. But there are grants associated with that. There's aspects of the teachers' pay increase, the pensions situation there, and those are not quite as clear as we'd like them to be. So at the moment, we're not actually able to say what the effect of that is on the bottom line. So I'd be grateful if you would, if you'd be happy to accept that we need to consult on that 594,000 gap. And when we get to the members' joint seminar on the 18th of February, by then it will be a lot clearer, and we'll be able to tell members just what the gap is. And of course, we'll take into account in that calculation any recommendations that come out of these consultation sessions, not just with members, but with members of the public as well, where we are able to entertain some of those suggestions to alter the figures. So the pressures are all scheduled out in the appendices there, Chair. The proposed actions to create the savings necessary to meet as much as we can at the moment of that is there. So we'll be happy to take questions. An awful lot of this falls within Frances's portfolio, so she will, I'm quite certain, tell you all about the thoughts behind why these proposals are coming forward.
Okay, open to questions then, councillors. Councillor Davis, thank you. Sorry, Alan, can you just put your microphone?
It's not under this portfolio, but I'm going to ask a question anyway. It says about the use of agencies and reducing the costs of agencies, and there's been a failure to reduce those costs. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Could you direct me to the section of the report, please?
Yeah, I will if I can find it now. I just read it.
Yeah, there's a use of agency staff across the county. What that more refers to is probably the need for social care agency staff to supplement our existing establishments whilst we have hold vacancies.
Okay.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, Chair. There's been an awful lot of work going into building in-house resilience to reduce our reliance on agency staff within social care, and that is really paying off now.
Councillor Davis, do you want to come back?
No, that's fine. I just wasn't quite clear about what I was referring to. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Watts.
Yeah. So I've just lost my... It's just expanded into something that I can't actually find out where I am now. But
Councillor Davis.
It related to...
Sorry, Councillor Davis, can you just put your microphone off? Thank you.
So it might be actually a good news story. Can you just expand on the harmonisation of finance relating to foster care and what that actually means.
Well, Francis wouldn't be able
You
to
know, we're straying a little bit off that.
Do it's in there.
It's in there,
What
but
that sum means. I mean, I understand
yeah.
what the issue is. I'm not asking for
Yeah.
an explanation about
It's
what
it-
foster care is, but,
yeah.
but the fees, the financial aspect.
It's in there because all the pressures are in there and all the savings are in there. But the idea today, I thought, Chair, was to talk about aspects that actually relate to economy and development, not social services. If we were going to discuss social services, we would have had somebody from that
I think
department.
I'm misunderstood. I mean, whilst it is an issue specifically, you know, foster care is an issue, it's a finance issue, and our job is to look at the overall finances. And I wasn't asking for a specific breakdown, but is it, I'm trying to be helpful in as much as, does harmonisation mean, Mark's got the answer, I'm sure, that we harmonise with other local authorities on what we pay?
I was hoping that my email yesterday might have explained the way that the budget process and the feedback is requested insofar as adult and children's services will look at those social care proposals. Obviously, at one level, we give all members the information that Cabinet has received because you have duties outside of your economy and development remit. The answer is that the 5 authorities across Wales in relation to foster care have differing rates. It's more equitable to apply a rate across Gwent that is the same. We historically struggle because of our location to generate sufficient foster companies' interest. It will incur a pressure because actually the harmonised rate is more than traditionally we would have paid for, but it does potentially also mean that we have access to a wider pool of foster carers.
Thank you.
Councillor Devi.
Don't tell me it's dead. No, it's alive. Thank you. I wanted just to ask you a question with regard to the agency staff. You were talking about the numbers. Is a shift in the numbers a reflection of being able to grow our own trained staff now in a manner that we meet the needs as they're evolving, if you like? So we've got more of our own trained staff and have less of a need to bring additional staff in. Am I making myself clear?
The difficulty that Francis would have in terms of the strategy applied to social care is probably more addressed to Julie and will be picked up in that forum. But essentially, qualified social care staff are like hen's teeth across local authority in terms of getting them in to work. We have a particular problem here in Monmouthshire because of our location. In terms of historically, being the most easterly council, we generally don't derive any ingress in staff from Bristol way because of the prohibited bridge tolls. So naturally, people will be working their way out from Bristol, and we get access to a wider workforce. The other aspect of this is that the service is probably less volatile now than it was in the past, that actually they had to respond to demand, and the only way to actually respond to demand, or the quickest way to respond to that demand, is through the use of agency recruitment rather than necessarily through your own personal interviewing process. But actually, because there's a more of a consistency of staff, the number of agencies needed is less. And I think at last count, when I looked at month 5, they were down to 2 agency staff within social care, where at the same time last year they were up in double figures. So that's an indication of how more consistent their staffing structure is this year.
Councillor Davis.
Right, I'll get on the right subject now, enterprise. Looking at this report, it appears the emphasis on the report is that there are many issues within the operations section in terms of passenger transport, 210,000 lost. And there's an issue about car parking and charges, increasing the charges in order to address some of the deficit there. My understanding with car parking charges is that any revenue that comes from that must be put back in to the transport infrastructure system. As I say, I've lost my notes. I also thought I read that it was costing us more to maintain it than we were actually taking in. I don't know whether that is the case, but my question really then is, do you anticipate that it will make any significant difference to the operations budget by increasing these car parking charges? And may it have perhaps it may have the opposite effect of affecting our town centres by charging more people to park, and therefore it will affect the businesses within those areas. Is increasing car parking charges a sensible strategy? Thank you.
Do you want to take this, Francis?
Yeah, that would actually be something that the Strong Communities Select would also consider with regards to car parking charges. Yeah, it's within my directorate, but I think the car parking charges sits within the Strong Communities Select. So with regards to car parking charges and the fees that are being considered, you are right that the investment goes back into the highways infrastructure and goes back into those service areas. Obviously that's quite a complex area because there's ongoing highways infrastructure and maintenance requirements that are always needed. Will the car parking charges have an effect on town centre footfall and town centre activity? That is something we will have to monitor and look at. As an example, increasing car parking spaces within the Abergavenny area on the opening of Morrison's has had an impact on car parking income across the whole in 2018-19. So it is very difficult to predict how one increase can affect something else.
I've been reliably informed by a very, very good source. The car parking has sat here historically. The previous committee had done a detailed piece of work before my time, but it does historically sit here, so we're right to ask it. Councillor Davies, did you want to come back?
I'm still on Francis here. I'm talking about tourism, leisure and culture, 257,000 overspend. And I'm also looking at some of the tables here in relation to some of the assets within there and their failure to reach their targets in terms of revenue. Now, I know this is all going or may be going into a different system, but have we got a strategy for addressing those shortfalls in performance and the overspend?
Just as a brief aside, are you looking? You're on the right report there, Councillor Davies. On the revenue, you're on the.
Can I just check? I did some rejigging of the agenda yesterday, and I wonder whether you're actually looking at the Month 7 monitoring report rather than the revenue budget proposals. Yeah, it's actually that will be the next item. We're actually on the revenue budget proposals.
Okay, I'll ask that question when it comes up.
Thank you.
Councillor Eason.
Well, thank you for letting me speak. Earlier on, Councillor Murphy mentioned about the ability to retain more of your resources when you pass on, for example. Am I right? Did you say that? It's linked into. No, Alan's got a problem with this big report. I think it might be by Tyrone Stokes, where somewhere in the reports there is a change. If this is the right committee to answer, I'm not sure. There's going to be a change in the recharge from selling properties after people have gone into respite care. That's also linked up to Tyrone Stokes' report, in as much as you're now going to look at respite care per night rather than per hour. Now, that could mean a substantial charge on, residents, the occupants of those beds. Can you expand on that? Can't find the bit about the houses being sold, but I got the bit about the Tyrone Stokes report regarding residential services. What impact will that have on our budgets?
I think.
As a point of order, I might have to declare an interest here.
Yeah, I think we are straying into to adult select committee there. To be honest, and as a member, I wouldn't want to deprive myself of asking relevant questions.
Chair, I think in terms of the information that's on this table, although Mark's is extensive in particular, that's not decrying what Peter knows, of course. You know, we really do need to talk about stuff to do with economy and development, not other scrutiny committees.
I understand that, but I'm trying to link it.
I made that comment just as an illustration as to how unexpected pressures can come forward.
So, yeah, right on. Thank you.
Could I direct you to the email that you had last night, and hopefully the table with the pressures and savings that actually relate to the Enterprise Directorate? That will probably help focus the feedback, if at all useful. I'm very happy to have a chat with you after the meeting if you wanted to talk about
I can
any
see them
social
linking
care
together.
aspects.
That's the only thing. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Easton, can you just sort of pop your microphone off? I've got a question in terms of pressures around energy and obviously fuel, and just trying to understand how we procure our energy and fuel for our fleet, and over what period we do that. You know, historically that there's been obviously various trends in the oil market. You know, we've seen it dip quite considerably over the last couple of years. There has been a slight increase, but it's trying to understand how long in advance we purchase our particularly our fuel and our energy, and just trying to understand some of those pressures.
So with regards to the fuel, it's managed centrally by, I think the gentleman's name's Ian Holcomb, is that correct? Yeah, the energy manager, and that's procured for all of our fuel costs. We are including a cost pressure within the portfolio this year because we get into the point where the annual increases in fuel costs, we are struggling to absorb that within the overall portfolio now. It's very difficult to guess and estimate what those fuel costs may be, and at the moment it is estimated that is going to affect us in the tune of, I think, is £40,000 per annum.
Okay. And in terms of energy, in terms of our, I mean, we're obviously we've invested in renewable energy ourselves, but just trying to understand I don't know if Mark, have you got more?
Yeah, both contracts are actually assisted through a regional procurement framework whereby all local authorities provide their needs, and actually the Welsh Procurement Service actually assist in those contracts. I think probably there is an argument as to whether we go alone in relation to procurement of certainly energy. We do look to reduce our energy costs where possible in terms of provision of PV panels on schools and other council buildings, and where we do that, after that investment is paid for, the school or the building concern derives the longer term benefit. But it'd be fair to say that in those annual negotiations that are undertaken regionally, we always generally see an increase in that rate. And actually, whether it's a case that we actually come outside of that contract and procure our own and try to do better, or whether it's a potential to become an energy generating body ourselves, you'll appreciate that actually on a small scale point of view, members approved a solar farm creation. We actually sell that back to the grid. Where we will get more benefit from that is actually utilising that energy ourselves. And that's certainly the flavour of some of the innovative business models, development companies, call it what you want, that the authority will need to look at in the future.
Thanks, Mark. A shiver went down my spine when you said MPS was involved in some of the facilitation work. My confidence levels dropped. Did Councillor Dovey, did you want to come in on energy? Is that something you wanted to focus on?
Really, to know whether we've had any feedback yet on the innovation that we were going to put in place in Abergavenny. And this was the introduction of hydrogen fuel for commercial vehicles. I mean, that is a really significant measure. That is, it hasn't, the benefits of hydrogen have not yet been appreciated by the market, I think. And especially the cleanliness of it, because it doesn't produce any bad odors or contamination of the atmosphere. And existing locations can be used for on sites like where you have a normal pump fitting for petrol. It will be the same for hydrogen, so you don't have to build something excessively expensive to market this fuel. It has huge potential. So I'd be, and I think we all ought to be, really interested in how this is working.
By means of an update, we have a provisional date for some training on the River Simple vehicle on the 24th of January. We are going back and forth at the moment with River Simple about the car trial in terms of insurance and ensuring that that's all managed correctly. They are having a few delays at the moment with regards to commissioning the vehicle with the DVLA. They hope to have that resolved in around 6 weeks. So hopefully over the next few months, then we will be in a position that we will be trialling the vehicles and obviously going through that trial with River Simple, testing it and identifying any issues as they may arise. But as you say, it's a very exciting opportunity and it'll be fantastic for us to see how it all works.
I'd welcome, once it's established and working, I'd welcome the opportunity to go and see the installation they have and what the local experience with it was, if that was possible, Chair.
Councillor Watts?
Yes, Chair. On 86 of 132, adult services. I'm not going to ask specific questions about adult services, but you'll see there's significant underspend there, and particularly then below that, community care.
Are you on the revenue report?
Have I skipped ahead? Am I? Is that
I
what
think
I've
you
done?
have. Yeah.
Do I do
Yeah,
apologise
yeah,
then?
that's
Sorry,
okay.
like it's kind of expanded and
Yeah.
contracted all.
That's
the time.
okay. Councillor Davis. Can you,
At least you got my question in 5 minutes' time.
Thank you, Chair.
Alan, could you just put your microphone off, please? Councillor Watts? Yeah, microphone. Thank you.
We may give the impression that we're slightly confused here, but we are. I think I'm on the right page now. All right. On page 78, it's got savings in relation to ADM on life of £331,000. Admin fees and charges uplift 59, discretionary fees, blah, blah, blah. In view of the current performance of the tourism and enterprise section and the failure to meet their targets, how are we predicting a £331,000 benefit from Mon Life?
Who's gonna pick this up?
I think it's 78 because it's all blurred.
Yeah. So if you I mean, either in the report or in the addendum that Mark sent yesterday, we've obviously got the savings and pressures, and it's on the savings proposals
This
towards
is,
the bottom end of that.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine, Councillor Davis. The £331,000 savings, they're a consequence of the current draft business plan that we are scrutinising, and obviously ahead of future decision around moving such services out linked to an ADM. So the budget proposals as stand at the moment, they are predicated on a transfer of those services out. So the business plan that is being constructed brings with it savings of 331,000. Some of those savings are consequential to the business rate savings, as you'd be familiar with from previous scrutiny around the ADM. Business rate savings, VAT savings, some gift aid savings, and then beyond that then there's an element of saving that relates to what the ADM is looking to achieve in the first year of its business plan in terms of making further advancements in terms of deriving additional income sources and income generation.
Sorry, Councillor, I don't think you...
Is where you were identifying those savings. Okay. Now you are aware that there are quite strict restrictions on the relationship between councils and charitable bodies and what you can do and can't do. And you can find yourself in very serious trouble if you're not very careful. Okay.
Any other questions? I've got a question in terms of on the savings side of things, the proposal regarding additional work for a highways team. Just trying to understand, are we looking to potentially compete with some of the big? I'm just thinking of the likes of Alan Griffiths. Are we looking to compete with some of those big contractors outside of county lines? Or it'd be just interesting to know some of that.
At the moment, we've got quite a relatively small highways department with a core staff team of about 25 members of staff there. We often find that there are projects and schemes that the team could take on and have the relevant skill set, expertise, knowledge, equipment to undertake, but we haven't quite got enough staff resource to do those pieces of work. So this is a risk to us to grow the team, but the concept is that we grow that resource in order to secure additional projects and schemes as they arise. So as an example, there may be a small capital scheme within the authority where we could undertake that work ourselves and we could offer a price for doing that work. At the moment, we have to turn that work down in the context of the balance of all of the other maintenance schemes that we're undertaking. So it wouldn't be competing for large schemes. We haven't got the ability and a capacity to do that. We're talking about relatively small schemes. The proposal that's included doesn't increase the income target significantly. We need to build upon this and build our commerciality and our skill set around this to build a team to deliver that.
So it's more trying to keep the revenue within the county than spend it on external contractors. Okay.
That's
Is
correct,
are there any sort of examples from other authorities doing similar work and making those savings?
No, I think there is an opportunity there for us to actually offer our services to other neighbouring local authorities and also be able to bid in for some of those contracts when they arise. I think we are very lucky that we do have a well-skilled team as it currently stands, and it's just a good opportunity for us to grow what we've already got.
I could just add a bit to that, Chair. We already contract in quite a few areas with for instance, we do a lot of grounds maintenance work for building contractors, Barrett's and whatever. Highways do a lot with Sutra. We do motorway maintenance and things, so this is nothing new. This is just consolidating what we already do.
Okay. Any other further questions? I suppose I'm going to steal Alan's question, but I think you were talking about costs and the increasing costs to the potential detriment of realising that revenue. There will be probably some concerns in relation to extending the parking day, increasing the charge to a Sunday. there's got to be someone or a number of people who've got to monitor and collect those ticketing costs on a wider day and on a Sunday. So the costs are going to go up there. It's just understanding the realisation of revenue to cost really, and has that all been factored into to what we've set out here? So, yeah, go on. Yeah.
Apologise. So, was it 10% there? It's 10% increase on charges, yeah, across the board. How you came to that decision when obviously clearly it's above the rate of inflation, but also the wider economic impact that it will have then on the local business community when, people now can quite easily, a lot more, people will be going across the Severn Bridge, for example. I can only speak from a Chepstow perspective. Parking for free on Cribbs Causeway and not pay the toll. So it's cheaper for them to nip across. I don't understand the overall economic policy where we have, and then I know I'm going to get told off by Phil because I can see he's ready to go, is that you have a car park for free in Caldicot and a car park that you have to charge for in Chepstow. There's something quite wrong with the policy. Now, I'm not going to get into issues where we ended up taking, the town councils ended up taking legal action. We don't want to kind of drag that up again because I don't think anybody's got the appetite for that. But I do feel some kind of feedback from talking to traders and people that come into town that they're a little bit bemused by these increasing costs. And I just wanted to understand what the rationale really was when it could be potentially detrimental to the local business community, which is already reeling as it is.
Let Francis answer most of that, but the point I was anxious to make is an extra 10p on park isn't going to be anywhere near the cost of driving to Cribbs Causeway, even with those savings. So it really depends on the offer that people are going for. But I know that's just to answer that one specific point. There was a lot more to it than that.
I think it's very difficult at the moment for us to predict what the impact of the Severn Toll Bridge lifting is going to have in terms of the economic impact for us, because there will be other benefits that could be derived out of that on other areas in terms of inward investment and businesses being able to relocate into the area without the charge. So it's difficult at the moment, I think, to predict what the impact's going to be there. In terms of town centres and the retail offer, that is a piece of work that we are going to need to look at in the future in terms of long-term strategic planning for town centres, in terms of what the towns offer, what they could be, and that impact of retail is changing. So we are mindful of that. Coming back to the car parking strategy and fees and charges for car parking, I think within the proposal we do refer to the fact that there is a recognised need for us to look at our fees and charging strategy for car parks in a far more holistic fashion and looking at that in a broader context. But there are proposals put forward for this forthcoming financial year that are set out within the papers, but I do agree that the whole car parking fee charging strategy will need a review at a point in time.
Microphone.
As Chepstow was built for cart and horse, the cart before the horse, and as much as before we go, shouldn't we be doing our work, talking to chambers of trade, traders, independent traders, and people who live still in the town? We don't want to. We've always been quite good, I think, at focusing and understand we don't want to create a donut effect in some of the older towns where people move away, keeping that community together. Why are we not simply talking to them first before we then simply put up charges? Why aren't we going through a consultation process first to understand the issues first before we do hit them for 10%?
We are engaging with the chambers and engaging with the businesses through this process, and obviously they will be part of this consultation process that's ongoing now throughout January.
Maybe I should declare an interest. I'm sorry.
No, you've got the floor, Armin. Why not?
So I should declare an interest because I'm a small trader, albeit a very small one, but there's been no consultation, none.
I think in terms of the wider issue, and I know there was a Wales Audit Office study, that said about Monmouthshire and its ability to increase charges and generate further income from charges. We need to be mindful, I think, in terms of where that ceiling is. We may not quite have reached it yet, but we're probably not. We're probably coming close. Councillor Feakins.
Thank you. And just further on that, I think it is important to include local members in that consultation process. In as much as the car parking isn't as simple as black and white. If we didn't have the car parking charges in some of the car parks in Monmouth town, then they would be full of people who work in the town, and people who want to shop in the town wouldn't have anywhere to park. So you've got to keep that balance, and it's about understanding that local dynamic as much as it is taking a holistic, higher view. That's all. Just to make sure the local members are involved in that consultation process.
And just to add to that as well, the importance of town and community councils. There's probably a number of us here before the Local Government Act comes in, where we'll have to make a decision on which which council we sit on. But it's having that having that engagement. We've highlighted, there's one highlight in here about potential pressure of Chepstow Town Council's removal of the TIC costs, but we need, and I know some of it has been played out in the sort of the regional cluster meetings, but it's not. I think we are, as an authority, moving away from that sort of here's your list, what would you want approach, where we come to a more integrated understanding of what each town and community council wants, what are their 3 to 5 year strategies, because they should have them, particularly those who are part of Future Generations Act, who fall over that threshold will have those plans. And it's understanding, because they've got they have got money, they've got obviously the ability to increase the precept, but it's working closely with them to understand what they want and realising benefits on both sides. I'll allow officers just to respond, and I'll go back to you. Okay.
Can I just come back, I guess, and just make a point of clarification, I guess, just with regards to the budget consultation. Information contained on our website, and obviously the release of the budget proposals and then being made public. But beyond that, we have an array of consultation events mapped out across January and clearly beyond select committees that are programmed in. Some of those are targeted around specific groups, such as the Access for All Forum, and there is a specific event around for the benefit of young people as well. But beyond that, and on a place basis, we are looking to present with an open invite at area committees throughout January. But beyond that, also the cluster events with town and community councils. So we're giving full opportunity there, and obviously looking to publicise that through our website. We're giving full opportunity there for members of the public to come forward and obviously feedback as part of the consultation. And we know that is a very important part of the process. These proposals are draft; they are not final. The consultation and the feedback from the public is incredibly important, and it obviously looks to bring to the fore and allow cabinet to reflect on that feedback before they look to deliberate on their final proposals, and ahead of that being presented in front of council.
Thanks for that, Peter. Councillor Feakins.
And just to come in for the record, that I don't think the increments as proposed at the moment are going to be the straw that broke the camel's back. I don't think 10% is the thing. It's more about what car parks do we take from being free to charge in, because those free car parks are largely provided to facilitate people to park outside of town for workers, to allow those shoppers to purchase in town.
Okay. Any other further questions? No. Councillor Dovey.
Could I just go back to my hydrogen thing just for a second? Very short point. I had forgotten that the Welsh Government had nominated the M4 through Wales as to be the first hydrogen-served motorway in the UK. Of course, nobody had got round to making the equipment that could deliver the product. Now, that isn't the case now. You can have the equipment to deliver to create the product delivered on the back of a truck, and they can set it up that way. The point I was wanted to make is that if there is any kudos to be gained from the work that we are doing with trialling this, we really ought to be looking at how we can work with Welsh Government and boosting Monmouth, the place for technology, etc., to attract new companies to the area, because it is such a singular, great opportunity if it really does come off. I believe electric cars are limited. I always have believed that. With hydrogen, it is such a super project if you can do it. And you haven't got to have power stations built in a way, making power to create electricity to put in your car. I mean, it's a great technology, and we ought to be trying to make the best of it.
Thank you for that.
Sorry,
Councillor
Chair.
Dovey. No, that's fine. That's fine. If there's no further questions, then we'll just do a brief summary. So we looked then at some of the pressures around fuel costs and energy costs, and I think potentially, as Mark touched on, if there's an opportunity for us to go it alone, and to obviously to look for opportunities to not just generate our own or capitalise on the use of the energy that we've generated ourselves, either on various assets, or as Councillor Dovey has said, looking at innovations like hydrogen and other electricity models for our fleets, then that's something that we should be exploring. We looked at some staffing pressures, agency staff. Looked at workforce, potentially or potential to grow workforce, particularly the highways workforce, to give us capacity to generate further revenue. Car parking charges we've explored quite a bit, and obviously moving on to the consultation, which we're going through, and there's a number of events that are taking place. Understanding local issues, I think, is going to be a key part of that. I think, as an authority, we will be listening, not just to the interests and concerns of members, but obviously the business interests and that of the town and community council sector as well, which is going to be really important. So in terms of the recommendation then, to consider and provide feedback upon the budget assumptions, pressures and savings, performance affecting this select portfolio area, and we provided feedback. Are there any other specific recommendations the committee would like to put forward at this stage? No? Okay. Thank you very much, officers. I think before we move on to the next agenda item, can we just have a short comfort break for 5 minutes? If we break and come back at 10 past, is okay? Thank you. Okay, councillors, we'll look to start this last session. Okay, so item, item 6 is the Revenue and Capital Monitoring Outturn Statement 2018-19. I think, as discussed with Mark earlier, this probably wasn't due to the next meeting, but given the budget consultations and the capital and revenue proposals that we've had this morning, I think it's prudent that we look at month 7. So, Mark, if you could just give us a sort of a brief overview again, and then we'll go into questions. Thanks, Mark.
Good morning again. The overall position for the council is predicted to be a £316,000 revenue surplus at month 7. You'll appreciate that table 3.15 shows the actual trends in forecasts over the last couple of years, and actually at this point of the year we would normally still be in a deficit position and working very hard to actually get the right side of the line. I think significantly there has been a lot of work done by services to rationalise their spending requirements till the end of the year, but significantly it's also been positively affected by an extra 1.3 million unforeseen capital money that we've got from Welsh Government, £440,000 of which are labelled as to capitalise revenue expenditure already in the system as being better capital nature. So if we hadn't have done that, we'd have still been in a deficit position, albeit a smaller deficit than in past years. But I'd just like to record the activities of the services in managing their budgets accordingly. So at month 7, 86% of savings were met across the piece, and the detail of that is in table 3.5.6. In relation to this committee, there are 3 savings which still have to be acted upon. Those are or mitigated. Those are the long-standing PTU pressures, the abortive waste saving that was put in last year that hasn't manifested itself, and obviously the loss of car parking income, and we can explore those things individually when we get to the question and answer session. Capital expenditure is likely to be £1 million over this year. You'll be pleased to know that not in relation to any of the projects in relation to E&D portfolio, which are predicted to come in on budget. That's largely as a consequence of future schools expenditure. And just to give you a bit of context, those 2 secondary schools in total involved £90 million worth of expenditure, just to put that £1 million in context. And you've spoken earlier about the uncertainty around asbestos, which is the predominant cause of such. 3.8 talks about reserve levels and the council fund reserve being within the parameters, financial planning assumptions that you've set yourselves. I'm always a bit of a worrywart to remind you about the level of earmark reserves, because I look enviously at those of other local authorities in the area. But I think we do quite a good job in managing our use of those, and you might be reminded that Audit Committee also periodically get an uplift of, an update of the reserve levels and consideration of what the calls on reserves are to actually test whether they're still valid and reasonable. So we have quite a good oversight in relation to use of reserves. Specifically, what I've done with the report, as usual, is to chunk it up over the various select areas. So the revenue spend in relation to economy and development is in paragraph 3.2.2. And you'll notice that despite a 316 revenue surplus, the actual enterprise part of it is actually still has a £600,000 overspend predicted against it, largely in the operation areas and largely recognising some of the inbuilt pressures in TLC that are actually removed or taken out of the system in looking at the budget position for next financial year. And at that point, I'm quite happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to just obviously remind members that can we just focus on the economy and development and enterprise portfolio area in terms of their questioning. Okay, questions? Alan, did you want to ask that question on car parks?
No, I've asked that question. I think we've dealt with most of the things that Mark's covered. We've actually covered in our previous discussions. I think. Obviously, it's concerning the amount of loss within that tourism and leisure facility. I know that there's things being looked at now to address that, and that needs to be an area that's concentrated on, obviously. Thank you.
Any questions? Councillor Watts?
Yeah, I know it's overall, I know you're going to tell me off, but it relates to what I was saying about the overall budget for CYP, and
I am going to tell you off. Can we stick to the area?
But I'm saying it impacts on the economic kind of, it does have a broader economic impact on us as an authority. Because if we're not, and just hear me out, if you say we doesn't have to answer the question, that's fair enough. But my see, I'll get my question in, is the level of deficit. And Mark knows that Mark and I talk about this occasionally. I'll grab him and he'll say, we'll wait for the next quarter to look at the figures. What I'm broadly concerned about is the level of deficit sitting with those schools, the strategy. So I know, see, I'm very, very sorry that I'm talking about something that's specific, but there's a cause and effect to this. In as much
The problem is, and Mark could give you a certain amount of answer, but the chief officer isn't here to expand on that.
He knows that I know that he knows what the answer is. Yeah. So
perhaps you can have that discussion outside of committee.
Well, then it have to be full council. I'm just trying to be helpful because I think there's an additional pressure potentially on the authority. It might be that Mark says no.
I'll give Mark a little bit of leeway to question, but I don't want to go into education because the children and young peoples want to explore that in their own right. Go on, Mark.
I appreciate that members, as well as having a ward responsibility and particular portfolio responsibility, may also be governing.
I'm not a governing body.
On governing bodies, so they might have an interest in this aspect. The reality is that collectively the draw on reserves is predicted to exhaust the collective level of reserves this year, and it moved them into a deficit position such that the authority is bearing that cash flow consequence in the short term. It does have an impact upon the council fund levels and the 4 to 6% of your financial planning assumption. So should that carry on growing, it could be very easy for that to be breached and for you to have a consideration. What we have seen, or what we have tried to do, if you look at month 2 in the report that went to Cabinet, is that we've changed some of the discipline around the delegation to schools that requires them to actually provide a recovery plan and consideration of the future at a far earlier stage than historically would have been the case, because I don't actually anticipate, or I increasingly question whether the forecasting is necessarily the problem. I mean, last year they collectively predicted a use of £900,000 of reserves. Come the end of the financial year, collectively they only used £80,000. So if I can improve the quality of the forecasting by encouraging them to actually do the exercise and recovery plan, I suspect I will get less governing bodies predicting an adverse situation going forward in a more realistic position. Time will tell on that. And we're still very much keeping it on the radar as a risk, and obviously the wider risk to the council is the effect on the council fund. But be reassured that CYP Select look at it in quite detailed when they look at their monitoring.
Thank you for your patience, Chair.
Welcome, Councillor Feakins.
Thank you, Mark. And just firstly, just to say. The schools programme, £90 million and only £1 million overspend, which is largely due to known unknowns, as you said, is incredible. I think it's fantastic. I think I think credit where credit's due. I think it should be given that there's not many commercial people out there who could deliver such a project at such a tight overspend. So I think that's fantastic. It is on. Is it not working? Can you not hear it? Okay.
Armand, sorry, I think yours is still on. If you take yours off.
It's Armand, sorry.
It's always Armand.
I noticed that. I'm getting used to this. I'm getting used to this, David. But just So that aside, so I think it's incredible. So I think, like I say, credit where credit's due. And it doesn't form necessarily part of your report here per se, but it does. It's of interest to me, and probably of interest. It should be of interest to others, maybe. Is that at the moment when we're collecting council tax, we're obviously collecting it over the first 10 months. And when we do increase the council tax, it obviously does have a month-by-month effect. And I've said in previous committees, if we were to spread that automatically over 12 months, the month-on-month increase would be negligible to people. It'd probably stay the same. Do we know if we were to automatically put people on a 12-month spread for that income? Do we know what the implications would be for us in cash flow terms? I know, because obviously at the moment I know that we are basing our income stream on those capital receipts coming in the first 10 months of April. But like I say, if we come to a situation whereby we were to suggest to our constituents that we automatically put them to 12 months, and that they wouldn't probably feel the hurt on those extra 2 months.
I may need to take some of that back to my colleague who deals with the revenue side of it in the council tax, because she's far more expert than me. But my recollection is that the 10 months is part of the council's requirement that it has to offer those.
Right.
I think we do, and this is what I need to check, is that we offer a discretion to anyone that wishes to enter a payment plan over 12 months, that we allow them to do so. From a cash flow point of view, if the majority of the electorate took up 12 months rather than 10 months, I think the cash flow effect probably quite negligible to the council, because we don't rely on it from a planning perspective, and there are a lot of factors that go into what is the cash flow balance at any one point in time.
Yeah.
So I don't think that would be a good reason not to do it. But as I said, we already promote 12 months. It's just very much people's wish whether they take it up. But can I check with Ruth as to maybe the relative uptake, so that you've got a perspective on how much flexibility that applies? Because it may be that if 80 or 90% already do 12 months, that it's even more of a negligible consideration.
Thank you. Much obliged.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to find out that. And I think as an authority, I think our yield collection is pretty high. But whether or not we can potentially expand that through the 12 months, and
And of course the hit on us would only be 1 year, because the second year we'd be into it. The benefit would probably only be short term for the residents as well, because they'd be very soon accustomed to, you're effectively just knocking out 1 year, aren't you? It wouldn't be year on year.
Sorry, Chair, if I may. Specifically on your point about yield collection, the Welsh Government used to have it's probably a bit unfair really, but before your time they used to have a league table of the best and the worst of the yield collection, of overall collection rates. And for a period of time, I'm sure it's changed now, Mark, we weren't that good against other local authorities that were demographically similar to us. Do we know where we are really, what kind of improvements have we made? I know that Phil did eventually take up another member of staff, didn't he, in collections, and there has been some improvement. But overall, what's the level of debt that we have sitting on uncollected council tax?
I can find out the actual amounts for you. I know that this is a point you've raised previously, and I suspect you've got knowledge predating my time here in Monmouthshire, which may very well be the case. But when I last checked, which was 2016, I think we were 5th or 6th in the league table in terms of our recovery action. Next year, I would have expected us to be higher than that in check-in, because we actually set a recovery rate in year of 99%. And I'm not sure that I'd expect many authorities to exceed that level.
No,
so,
but in real terms, if I may, Chair, that our debt was something like, it was about 3 million, something like that uncollected debt. Now, I'm only guessing, but what that meant for a Band D, what it equated to, because it's always levelled at a Band D, isn't it, Chair? That it was something like £96 per household on a Band D. Now, I'm sure there has been some improvement by then, but is there any way, because these things aren't published anymore by Welsh Government because they thought it was too competitive, I assume, is there any way of finding out?
Yeah, I wouldn't put you on the spot to pull that information out, Mark. But if you could come back to us with that, yeah, that'd be really useful. In terms of obviously pressures over the next few months, you know, if we see another winter as we did last year, you know, obviously on our highways fleet, you know, the gritting capacity. What sort of contingency have we got aside in terms of our winter preparedness? Would it put, you know, another? I know there was we did receive a significant grant back from Welsh Government. It didn't cover all the costs, but it was a good grant slice. But just trying to understand what the potential pressures would be.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to pick up as well, if I may. I've just identified a typographical error on page 79 of the report. I've stated, whilst the month 7 forecast indicates an underspend for the Directorate, that's not correct. It is a net overspend for my whole Directorate. So just to be clear on that. The highway section at the moment are reporting a forecasted break-even position. You're right, as we enter into the winter period, we've been fortunate so far that we haven't had any significant adverse weather events, which is fortunate. There is a risk that if we do, then, and there is a deterioration in the weather, then we could have an impact on our expenditure. You're right, last year Welsh Government did support local authorities, which did fund part of that expenditure, but it didn't cover all of the expenditure. The way in which the winter maintenance budget is established within the Highways Maintenance Department is that it covers our predicted normal costs for normal gritting and for covering those staff costs on the rota. It doesn't forecast and cover for significant adverse weather events. So if we were to experience weather like we did last year, that would have an effect on the financial outturn.
Okay. Yeah, Mark.
And just putting that in context, the two main areas where you'll see a pressure is around your domiciliary care services, around the adult side of it, and the gritting and highway side of it. The pressure in relation to the actual gritting is in the volume of salt used and any overtime payment paid. You'll appreciate that actually there aren't any drivers per se for gritting. We actually utilise teams and existing drivers from other parts of the service. So for instance, you probably wouldn't be doing grass cutting when the snow's on the ground, so you can utilise them for that. It's not a pound-for-pound consequence because generally they're out at some very unsociable hours, etc. So there is a make-up aspect to it. But last year, the costs of our highways and operational aspects was of the tune of about 400,000. We got back 30,000 from Welsh Government because they used the standard formula for public financial awards and the settlement data, which took no account of the fact that actually those authorities more inland, more rural, etc., generally had a more challenging prospect in dealing with the snow than those coastal authorities with more clement environment and actually a better road infrastructure.
Any other questions on winter? No. Obviously, the other element of overspend, PTU. I think, Francis, you know, you've in your commentary, you've given us some context there. In terms of the Sen Transport budget, is there going to be any impact? Obviously, after the ALN review and the implementation of legislation, are we going to see that budget additional budget pressure there? Because we're going to potentially see more students who are going to realise.
Thank you, Chair. That's a really valid point. The department are working with the team with the ALN review to understand what those implications may be, because you're right, there will be implications for us in terms of transport for those young people. So we will be identifying where there are opportunities for us to work with the service to ensure that the PTU transport service is aligned to what that future ALN implications will have.
Councillor Watt. Can you just put your microphone on? Sorry. You're not on, I don't think.
Sorry. Back to adult care, if I may. Sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit.
This has to be related. You're gonna have to.
I'm happy not to fire the question if I'm driving you nuts. I apologise.
You are. To be frank.
It's all right.
I'm sure it's similar to this meeting where Councillor Eason has come along and not been a standing mate. If you wanted to go along to adult meeting, you could probably ask your question then.
All right.
It's just, and you know, I'm conscious of the experience of the officers here, particularly Mark. You know, Mark's been here quite an extensive amount of time, but getting that accurate information for the record.
Yeah.
You know, we need the appropriate officers here to do it.
I mean, with respect to Mark, you know, see what I know about Mark, he knows everything. He's fastidious. He's like Alex Ferguson was in the earlier days at Man United. You know, he used to turn up at people's doorsteps, wondering what they would do. He's not quite that bad, but I know he knows a lot of detail. Yeah, he's everywhere.
It's not painting a good picture, Mark. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it isn't fair on Mark to put that pressure on him. So I'm not going to allow that any divergence down that line. Councillor Dovey and then Councillor Feakins.
Really, it's to support you, Mr. Chairman. Councillor Watts and myself have known one another for a little while now. And I'm minded that he will always try his very best to get a question answered that perhaps is that one step further. And I can understand it to some degree, but there is one thing I think is different. If you are doing that in town council, for instance, and you're not being streamed, that might be okay. But I'm really conscious of the fact that the officer, when we've got live streaming here, shouldn't be put under pressure to answer something that he really shouldn't be answering. Yeah. And I think we have a duty as members of this committee to be careful about what we ask of our officers. Yeah. And that's the only part. I'll say that about everybody, but I know this.
I take your point, Councillor Dovey.
I know this esteemed councillor.
He's a born entrepreneur, always looking for that opportunity.
Entrepreneur was not the word I was grappling for, but he was born, definitely.
Yeah. No, yeah, I understand, you know, and you know, I always say I try and give members latitude to ask questions, but you know, we need, particularly on this area of finances, we need to be really focused on our remit as a committee. So the Councillor Feakins.
Thank you. Taking at your offer of latitude.
Don't push it either.
No, that was on record. We got it now. No, and it is not directly related to this, obviously. But do we have sort of scenario planning for a no-deal Brexit? Is that within our mindset, or do we just?
That's a bit wide as well.
Do you think?
That's a bit wide as well. No.
Not necessarily. Okay, so let me narrow.
I'll just remind you, there's a seminar next Tuesday afternoon.
That's true. Okay, let me narrow. Can I narrow it then? In that case,
narrow it right down.
Okay, what would we do? Okay, I don't think I can narrow it. It was effectively to see where do we have to start modelling? Do we have to put the resources into modelling these different types of scenarios, or do we just keep going along the line? And it was more to do with the resources of the modelling, not to do with the outcome of those models. Do we have to start putting work and effort into that modelling?
I think that'll probably become more evident next week. I mean, unless Francis wants to give us a brief synopsis of what we're in store for next Tuesday.
Clarify then. That's not. I'm not looking for any definite thing. It's just simply do we have to start spending 3 hours a week thinking about these things?
Okay, so I have been identified as the lead chief officer for Brexit. That doesn't mean that we are bringing together a team of resources to consider it, but what we are doing is just pulling together relevant officers within the authority to understand what the potential risks could be and understanding what those issues may be. Many of those already fall within our normal business continuity management plans, our normal emergency plans. So we're just ensuring that they are up to date, that they're reflective of any potential impacts. It's very difficult at this stage to understand what those impacts may be, and it's a little bit of crystal ball gazing here, isn't it? So we are doing what we can in order to be prepared, and there is a officer working group looking at it. And I think the presentation next week by WLGA will be really useful for them to identify the things that we should be thinking about that perhaps we aren't yet, or the things that we are already looking at and considering.
Go on, Mark, and then back to Councillor Figgins.
Yeah, from a purely financial perspective, it's a bit bittersweet, but we don't derive any great European funding per se in relation to Monmouthshire. That means that there will be holes in our funding come April time. But it's very difficult sometimes to actually work out the background of funding to some loans, to some grant monies from, say, Welsh Government, because you don't know the thread of where that funding has come from. We have met with Welsh Local Government Association to work through some of this. I wouldn't go so far as to say there are any grand plans or a budget scenario placed for Brexit, either no deal or deal. I think probably the single biggest risk to the council is that actually the council is looked as a protector for the electorate, and actually we probably look to help facilitate anything in terms of the effect on the communities, which we don't currently need to do at the moment. But actually being able to quantify that, what that might be, is probably a bit of a movable feast until we might have to suck it and see.
Go on. Put your microphone on. Put your microphone on briefly.
Well, it was only that historically, Chepstow had a town regeneration that was partly funded from European funding. That won't happen with Caldicot.
No, that's right. Just on that sort of funding for us things, so now we're using resources in order to, or starting to use resources to look at maybe those different scenarios, and it's completely movable feast. None of us know what that's going to be, but obviously it is encroaching on officer time and therefore resources. Is there any funding that's come down from Westminster or down from Welsh Government in order to support that officer time?
WLGA have been able to secure some funding via Welsh Government to establish a small team that are looking at this on behalf of local government across Wales. But us as a local authority, no, we haven't got any additional resources for it.
So there was, just to say, Welsh Government were given a £50 million pot to allow them to utilise some Brexit planning from Westminster. So, the WLGA have bid for money, NHS Confed have bid for money, so they're doing their various work streams. There's organisations involved with social care, like ADSS Cymru, which I have to declare an interest in because I do some work for them. They're involved in putting a bid forward to understand the social care piece across Wales and how that impacts. So there is various streams of work, not necessarily going down granularly to the local authority, specific local authority, but it's done under umbrella groups. So, yeah.
Could I just make a suggestion that we could maybe look at running a ferry service from Chepstow? That might help.
You're gonna tell me you've got a company ready and lined up. Two other areas that I just briefly want to explore. I know we've explored car parking quite a bit, but obviously given the media attention on Abergavenny and Morrison's, there's nothing really we can do about it, is there? Really, it is going to impact on us. Similarly, I suppose in Chepstow and in Caldicot, there large supermarkets there. Members of the public will utilise those car parking spaces. That there are specific remits under which they are allowed to use those spaces. That I think there's time constraints, and in some that they employ that you need to buy a certain amount of goods in a shop, in the given shop. There's some I would say unscrupulous supermarket chains that are using the roving eye technology and clocking people coming in and out, and will penalise people quite significantly. I know that's going to happen. But as an authority, there's nothing really we can do about it. So, we look in terms of mitigation. There's what can we do to try and realise some of that lost revenue?
I think it's about thinking a bit differently. I mean, the point was raised earlier that actually the increasing charges, well, how that would affect traders. Actually, part of the thinking and being a fly on the wall to Conservative Group was a recognition that some of these car parks are used and cars are parked there all day, so that they're not available for those people that want to use it for 1 or 2 hours sort of thing to do their shopping and get out. So it might actually be a beneficial effect to traders. But recognising that free car parking from supermarkets is a flavour of things to come. Probably our thoughts need to turn to whether we need to provide car parking in the same vicinity, and if not, what can we possibly do with that space? Back to your conversations earlier about housing, land, etc., and development. So it's probably a different conversation than we would traditionally have. But we still need to be thinking about these things in terms of where we can mitigate our expenses or where we can utilise opportunities.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Go on, Councillor Devi, you're going to come in on this particular point? Yep.
Yeah, just a very quick point. We, about 4 years back, we did a survey on the car parks in Chepstow, and just for an example, Welsh Street car park in the morning was basically full by about 12 o'clock, and 60% of that were people that were actually working in the town, and they didn't move their cars all day. So it's a strange one, really, in that a business, there's different sort of businesses, but businesses want people to come in and be able to park, and yet businesses want to be able to park there themselves. And you couldn't, we couldn't decipher what to do. Roger Hoggins had a crack at this. We even made a car park right down at the bottom, down by the castle. Made that a car park for the people working in Chepstow to be able to park there all day for virtually nothing. It was nominal or whatever it was. They wouldn't do it. The fact that they could go there and park for nothing, they wouldn't do it. So it's a very difficult question, so almost insoluble, really.
Okay, yeah, good point made. Councillor Roden.
Thank you, Chair. Just on the theme...
Councillor Devi, sorry, can you just... Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Just on the theme of parking. Earlier, Francis, you mentioned that you would monitor the effect of the increase in charges. How will you actually go about doing that? And if you do actually see a reduction in charges in any car park, would you tend to look towards reducing the costs to the public in those car parks? And if you, counter side of that, if a car park is being used very heavily, would there be a recommendation to actually increase the charges in that car park? Thank you.
There are multitudes, aren't there, of options around the car parking fees charging strategy, and you're right, it may, there are some local authorities that charge higher prices for the ones that are closer to the town, differential pricing for the ones that as you move a further distance, free car parking for certain car parks for recognising that people need to park there to work and then walk into town. So there are lots of different models that can be adopted. In terms of monitoring it, obviously we can monitor the impact of the car parking charging through our income. We are introducing the new car parking machines as well, which will potentially change the way in which people pay to use the car parks with the being able to pay by card and contactless as well. So there's lots of different things all happening at the same time in terms of car parking. So it is something we're going to have to really monitor closely, and on an individual car park basis as well.
Councillor Rowland,
I also noticed that Councillor Dovey was talking about an extra car park that was put in for shop workers, etc., in Chepstow that was hardly used. This is down by the castle, is it not? Is he not referring to that? Oh, it was potentially, it was never put in place, is that what you're saying? Sorry, I'll finish the point.
I don't want an explanation, but if you can just stick to your point on,
yes,
on,
then you
on
come
the,
back
on
to
the
me.
question.
Yeah. If we have car parks that are full in town centres, then and if they're partially filled with the shop staff and people working in the town centres, could we not actually try and incentivise them to move out further in the same way, but also publicise the fact that we're going to do it by some means? So that it's encouraging people to recognise that their jobs depend on people coming into their shops, and if they actually park a little bit further out, allowing people to come in, they would probably be better off in the long term. Thank you.
Yeah. Did you want to answer that, Francis?
No, I think those
okay,
points are
the
valid,
points,
and we can
okay.
take them on board. Thank you.
Councillor Feekins first, because you did have your hand up, and then Councillor Watts. It's continuation on the
Thank you,
parking
Chair.
theme, I can see.
Yeah, no, yeah, only very quickly. As we're moving towards the position of us collecting, because all this is about enforcement at the end of the day, as we're moving towards the position of collecting these fees ourselves and the enforcement of those issues, I'm guessing that we should be considering ANPR, and I'm guessing that will also tie in with the CCTV groups that we've already got in place, because if those two are tied in together, we're effectively saving. We've got a budget already for CCTV monitoring in the High Street. If that was rolled over into the ANPR as well, are we potentially moving towards a position where that's all... It works in the service stations. When you're overparked by 10 minutes in there, they send you a bill quite quickly, so I'm sure we could do the same.
Yeah, I'm not sure how overly popular that would be, but go on, Francis, yeah.
We will be introducing the civil parking enforcement in the next year. However, we haven't gone into looking into ANPR at this stage, but there are, as you say, lots of car parks like supermarkets that do utilise it and utilise it very effectively, but it isn't something we've considered yet.
Councillor Watts?
I'm gonna literally park that up and let that responsibility fall on Matt's shoulders forever and a day, having lived through being on the town council and explored all those options. It's not like we've just rocked up over the years and just we'll have a stab at car parking this year to raise some revenue. The dynamics and debate, the bitterness, the battles have been more extensive than any debate we've ever had about computers in this authority. Lengthy, painful, and they go on, and you know that, Paul, because I know you follow form. It's a really emotive subject, and I think we have to be very, very careful about how we roll this out, and we have to consider the views of the residents who live near the car parks. We have to consider the expectations that traders have for an already under pressure, chamber of trade, community, business community, particularly, I might say that in Chepstow. Tremendous strain on them. It isn't the proportion of people that are using the car parks that work in town are relatively small, despite some of the discussion here. And it saddens me that we haven't really kind of considered that those people also then pay an all-day stay pay pass. They pay for that. So why shouldn't they park where they've paid to park, frankly? It's for us then to look at finding additional car parking spaces. In Bulwark, for example, that's gone to, to, what's it called, Euro Parks or whatever it's called now. So parking is finite. It's a very, very difficult subject to manoeuvre around. So I have some sympathy. But if we're thinking this is an answer to all our problems as far as kind of funding highways, you're going to be mistaken, because every time you push at that and look to raise revenue from that, there's always a high level of resistance, and I know that from previous experience, So also then you've got to face then the potential for legal challenges from local authorities, which you've had before. you had a potential of a judicial review and folded on that. It was albeit that there was a political change after that and it never followed through, but there is always that potential risk. So I would urge caution really, and I certainly wouldn't endorse any CCTV Big Brother kind of coverage in the car parks about where people may or may not be parking for how long for.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. I'm sure committee and officers appreciate that advice. I mean, particularly in terms of civil enforcement on the street, you know, it is going to be an issue, and particularly in congested towns. You know, we, as residents of and those who represent Chepstow Market Town, you know, we see the abuse that is taking place on a daily basis, and having that enforcement power would be, you know, is really important. But we're probably going down a different track now. Councillor Davis, do you want to interject or come in on a one last point, and then I'll wrap this up then. Good. Can you just put your microphone on?
One of the concerns I have is that, you know, these little things in the overall scale of things are not going to address many of the issues. It's the big topics that really, you know, and we're talking about attracting more business, and we've spoken about the housing, and I think one of the concerns I have that we're putting more and more pressure onto officers, because, you know, it's all very well having these ideas, but there's a finite resource here. And I've made this point before several times, that there are people within various committees that have a lot of experience, you know, in different sectors, and perhaps we could make better use of utilising those members when it comes to, you know, looking at some aspects and how we can improve our performance, because there's only so much that people can do. And I think we really need to identify what is the strategy for those key areas and concentrate on them. Because, I mean, some of these little things we've made, like the breakfast clubs for schools, for example, have backfired, because far from giving us more income, they've given us less income. So I think rather than tinkering at the edges, we need to concentrate on those core things. And, you know, we need to generate more income, because things are not going to get easier. I suspect they're going to get significantly worse in the short term, at least. And we really need to push forward with those big schemes and get things moving. And, you know, I don't know about you, Francis, but I would have thought you need all the help you can get. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, councillors, and thanks, officers. There's no real recommendation there other than to note the current budgetary position. Obviously, this paper goes to Cabinet for their various recommendations, and I think we've noted that, and we've scrutinised those areas, not just in this particular report, but across the other two reports that we've looked at this morning. So, can I thank Mark and Francis for your input. The next agenda item then is item 7. So 7.1 is to confirm the minutes of the special meeting on the 19th of October 2018. Anyone happy to move those? Yeah, thank you. Do we need a vote on that? Yeah. All there, thank you. Oh, you abstain. Okay, and one abstention. Councillor Roden, thank you. 7.2, ordinary meeting on the 22nd of November 2018. Listen to move those minutes. Yeah, thank you. All in favour? Thank you. That's unanimous. Thank you. Okay, item 8 then is actions arising from the previous meeting. Hazel, do you want to? Yeah, taken forward. Yeah, thank you. Item 9 then is the forward work plan.
Firstly, to draw members' attention to Tuesday the 22nd of January, which is the first of the LDP workshops. It will be hosted by this committee, but all members will be invited. So as many of you as possible, if that's okay, to try and attend that, because obviously your committee is leading that work. Then we've got on the 22nd. I believe it is 10. We'll just check.
22nd.
2 o'clock. It's a 2 o'clock.
The second one is in the morning, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Then on the 28th of January, there's a members' seminar. 28th? Yeah. Members' seminar, and that's also on the LDP. It's to understand candidate sites coming forward, possible sites for inclusion into the LDP. So that's at 10. And then the 14th of February is your next meeting, Chair. Hopefully, I think we'll sort of have alternative delivery model back, and hopefully we'll have broadband as well. There will be future workshops, but I've had a concern from a member regarding one of the dates, so we're going to have another look at that. And okay, thanks.
Any questions, issues on the full work programme? They're all happy? Okay. So then item number 10 is to confirm the date of the next meeting. I think Hazel just said then, Thursday the 14th of February at 10 o'clock. Obviously pre-meeting 9:30. But hopefully you can all make the 22nd. Really important start of a suite of workshops and seminars on the LDP. You know, I think we've discussed it in various committees of this committee. We want to try and build consensus early on to try and avoid any long-term or any political clashes towards the end game when we bring forward the various proposals and to vote on that. And again, you know, it's important that any ideas councillors have, you know, from speaking to constituents in their wards, any concerns early on, you know, those are brought to the table so we can examine them in detail. Okay. Yeah.
And I think there was consensus that the LDP is such a fundamentally important thing. So we talked, and we had, I'm trying to think of the officer now, it escapes me, the future working, whatever thing he's on now, future economies, yeah?
Bob Dwyer? No.
Yeah.
Bob Dwyer.
Robert Dwyer.
Yeah.
Future Monmouthshire. And I don't know if it sits with him really, but so we talked about democratising the whole thing and building a consensus. So if there's a public consensus, you're more likely to get politicians because, you know, we're afraid of the electorate, you know, so we should be. So if there's public consensus and we can build on that public consensus, we're more likely then to collectively go along with it. Because I know, you know, again, I know what happens. I've seen it before. We walk into a room and everybody votes one way and someone else votes another way, even though we've really got on and we've done a lot of work together. And I would really like to see that broken down this time, because I genuinely think there is consensus, and it's different now and it's very important. But when it comes to public engagement, we talked, didn't we, about the schools? You remember extending that to some discussion with parents, going into schools and at you know, a specific point. And I know it's not one for this meeting. It could be, you could say, well, it's an issue for CYP again, but there's got to be a way of, this affects their children and the future economy for the local children and future communities, doesn't it? So schools is a good place to start, I think, and I would like to really draw your attention to that as well, and ask really if we could extend through you, Chair, that invitation to schools to participate in the LDP with parents.
Yeah, no, I remember your you know, you raising this particular point, Armin. I think you're absolutely right. You know, as Chief Officer for Resources said, you know, during this budget consultation period, there is going to be particular focus meetings on particular groups. And I think, you know, there's no reason why we can't take a similar approach to the LDP. That, you know, we work with particular groups in society, and, you know, obviously parents and potential parents, you know, obviously are really important. You know, I know from, you know, some of the schools in Chepstow, you know, birth rates, you know, slipping, and then, you know, within a few years you're starting to question viability of schools, and, you know, it's a slippery slope. So I think you're absolutely right. We will look at that. We'll try and build some workshops in around that. I think Francis has taken that on board. Okay. Thank you all for your time and your contributions, and see you soon. Thank you.